Weapons stashed in a hidden bunker, a Soviet nuclear bunker turned into a nightmare ant graveyard, massive underground complexes beneath Normandy beaches, families discovering bomb shelters under their gardens, and a man holding someone hostage in a tiny Alabama bunker rigged to explode. These disturbing discoveries found inside restricted underground bunkers. So this whole thing started as a pretty standard investigation in late 2025. Police in Northern California were looking into a property over some illegal green growing. Nothing crazy on the surface, just another property they were checking out. But then they found the entrance. It wasn't inside a building or anything obvious like that. It was a tunnel around 100 feet long, running through what was basically a big concrete pipe. You had to go through the whole thing just to get to what was at the other end, and what was at the other end was a bunker. Proper one. It had power, ventilation, drainage, real flooring. Someone actually knew what they were doing when they built this thing. Once investigators got inside, they realized pretty fast this was a much more serious operation than they thought, because the bunker was packed with firearms and thousands of rounds of ammo. Some of the weapons had their serial numbers removed. Others have been reported stolen years before. The guy who owned the property, Michael Kemfold, got arrested, ended up facing a long list of weapons charges. In 2013, some researchers went down into an old abandoned Soviet nuclear bunker in western Poland. The place had been sealed since the early 90s. It was just empty concrete rooms that had been sitting in complete darkness for over 20 years. While they were walking around, they started noticing ants. A few at first, then more. There were so many that it looked like parts of the floor were actually moving. But there was no reason for ants to be there. Nothing grows there. There's nothing to eat. So they started looking around to try and figure out where they were coming from. Eventually, they traced it back to a rusted ventilation pipe up in the ceiling. Above that pipe was a normal ant colony living up top. Over time, the metal had rotted just enough that ants were falling through it and dropping down into the bunker below. And once they were down there, they couldn't get back out. What researchers pieced together is that this wasn't really a colony in any normal sense. There was no queen down there. The ants on the floor were just the ones that had fallen in and gotten stuck. The only reason any of them were still alive was because of what was already covering parts of the ground. Dead ants piled up. The living ones were eating them. This one stayed hidden for decades, sitting right next to some of the most visited beaches in Normandy. In 2006, a guy named Gary Stern bought an old World War II map off a former US soldier. The map pointed to something buried between Omaha and Utah Beach, so he went out to see what was actually there. At some point, he was walking around and he felt concrete under his feet all of a sudden. He pushed through some overgrown bushes and found an entrance that had been completely buried. Once he got inside, it opened up into a full underground complex. Not just one room, tunnels, storage rooms, living spaces, even a small hospital. It was part of something called the Macy Battery, a military position that was built for D-Day. After the invasion, it got abandoned and nature slowly swallowed it up. When people finally explored it decades later, rooms were completely untouched. Equipment was still sitting there. The whole layout was basically frozen in time. One explorer described it as a, quote, strange feeling, a somber, dark experience. But people have been walking those beaches for years, decades, and the whole time, this massive bunker was right underneath their feet. Some forestry workers up in southern Scotland were out cutting down trees when they came across an old iron door set in the ground. That was weird enough that someone called in archaeologists. What they found was a forgotten World War II bunker. It was part of a whole network of secret shelters built in case Britain got invaded during the war. Specifically built for special guerrilla units, guys who were trained to hide, wait, then slip out at night and cause as much chaos as possible behind enemy lines if an invasion happened. The bunker was around 23 feet long and about 10 feet wide, buried under a couple feet of earth, with a thick iron hatch on top and an escape hatch that had been filled in at some point. When they got inside, it was mostly empty, just a rusted tin can and some bits of what looked like an old wooden bed. Originally, it would have been stocked with bunks, supplies, enough gear to last 2 weeks. Sean and Carrie Tullier bought a house on the island of Guernsey, off the coast of France. They knew that the land had been used by occupying forces during World War II, but nobody thought there might be an actual bunker buried under their driveway. The tip came from someone who used to live there back in March of 2022. Sean said, "From the outside, you could tell it was sitting on top of something. We've been doing up the house anyway, so I hired a digger, and with the help of a mate, we started digging up the driveway to see what was there." After a while, the ground gave way and a doorway appeared. Inside was a really solid underground structure. 2 main rooms, one about 17 by 10 feet, the other 17 by 20. Tiled floors, an escape hatch, in German writing all over the walls. One of the phrases translated to "beware, the enemy is listening." They also found old tins and bits of debris left behind. The couple decided to turn it into a games room and gym, but according to Sean, quote, "It's not just a games room. People come along and ask to see the history. I know it was a bad time for Guernsey during the occupation, but I do find the history fascinating. I think we need to keep it so we remember what happened." Speaking of water in weird places, how about a massive water reservoir in space? In 2011, astronomers using radio telescopes picked up something enormous surrounding a quasar. It's about 12 billion light years away, which means we're looking at it as it was when the universe was still pretty young. Just a few billion years old. What they found wrapped around this quasar was a massive cloud of water vapor. And the amount of water in it is genuinely hard to get your head around. At least 140 trillion times the total water in all of Earth's oceans combined. Now, that early in the universe's history, it's kind of odd to see water on that scale. Building up enough oxygen to make that much water takes time. It needs multiple generations of stars to form, burn through their fuel, explode, and scatter heavier elements out into space. That whole process takes a very long time, but this gargantuan cloud is, or was, already sitting there. Near the Salton Sea in California, there's a mud spring called Nealon Geyser. For a long time, it's just sat there bubbling away. But around 2018, it started moving, slowly sliding across the ground, and it kept going. Over time, it picked up pace, eventually drifting several meters a year, cutting a path through whatever happened to be in front of it. People tried to stop it. Engineers put up barriers, they dropped big rocks in its path, tried to redirect it. Nothing worked. The mud just slipped underneath or pushed through the sides. At one point, it was heading straight for a major railway line and nearby roads. At that point, the call was basically just to move everything rather than try to stop the geyser. Nobody's totally sure what's causing this. Something underground, pressure building up, geothermal activity. That's the general thinking, but the specifics haven't really been figured out. There's no obvious event that set it off the way you'd see with, say, a landslide. Whatever's pushing it seems to be coming from deep down. In 2004, geologists working for a mining company called Rio Tinto pulled a new mineral out of the ground in Serbia. On its own, finding a new mineral isn't a huge deal. It happens. But when they ran the analysis on this one, something came up that nobody expected. The chemical formula was almost identical to the kryptonite described in Superman Returns from 2006. Same combination of elements: sodium, lithium, boron, and silicon. Only things it was missing were fluorine and obviously the green glow. In 2022, astronomers announced they might have found the first black hole ever spotted drifting through space on its own. Normally, black holes get detected because they are near something. They pull material off nearby stars, they affect how objects move, they leave traces. This one had none of that. There was no star next to it, no system around it, nothing to interact with. The way they spotted it was through something called gravitational microlensing. When a really massive object drifts in front of a distant star, it bends the light from that star and causes it to briefly look brighter. By watching how that brightness changes, scientists can get a rough idea of how massive the object doing the bending actually is. In this case, it seems to be several times the mass of the sun. In August 2023, NOAA was running an exploration dive off the coast of Alaska. They had a remotely operated vehicle going along the sea floor when it came across something odd. It was a small, smooth golden sphere sitting on the ocean floor. It had a tiny hole on one side. It looked almost like something manufactured, like a little metal object, but when they got a closer look, it was clearly organic. The whole thing was recorded live, and even the scientists watching had no idea what they were looking at. One of them made a comment about hoping nothing was going to crawl out of it when they picked it up. He used the ROV arm to carefully collect it and bring it to the surface. Turns out it is biological, but beyond that, you don't really know much. The best guess right now is that it might be some kind of egg casing from some unknown species. It's still being looked at. For now, researchers can tell you what it looks like, feels like, and what it's made of in a general sense, but not what it comes from. In 2024, a family in Southwick, England had been living in their house for 3 years without having any idea there was a World War II bunker sitting under their garden the whole time. It only came out when they started doing some work in the backyard. Catherine Milburn, one of the homeowners, said they were digging around when they hit something strange under a summer house. She said, "There's about a 3-meter long piece of concrete underneath the summer house in the garden. We noticed steel bars. We thought it was a bit over the top for a summer house. Then we got to a corrugated iron sheet. They kept digging into the night and eventually found steps going down into a water-filled tunnel. Turned out this is a wartime air raid shelter. Historians think that what they found is what's called an Anderson shelter, a specific type of shelter that was buried in people's backyards to protect families from air raids during the war. Very few of these things are still around. Millions were installed before and during the war, but most got filled in or dug up afterward. Finding one intact is genuinely rare. And here's a similar case. Over in Kent, England, a woman named Rebecca Hobson wasn't exactly planning on making a big historical discovery in her own backyard, but it was 2020, this was the lockdown, and she had more time on her hands, and she ended up getting into talking with some neighbors about an old concrete slab sitting in her garden. People in the area had been saying for a while that there might be something underneath it, so she lifted it up. What she found wasn't just some old cellar, it was the entrance to a 160-foot underground bomb shelter built during World War II, also used to shelter people during air raids. Rebecca hasn't gone into a lot of detail about exactly what's inside, but just the fact that something this big had been sitting under a regular backyard for decades without anyone knowing, it says a lot. There's a huge amount of history still buried under totally normal homes and gardens across England, and nobody even knows most of it is there. In 2013, in Midland City, Alabama, police were dealing with a 65-year-old man named Jimmy Lee Dykes. He'd shot a school bus driver, grabbed a young boy off the bus, dragging him down into a bunker he dug under his property. The space was tiny, maybe 6 by 8 feet, reinforced, and he'd rigged it with at least one explosive. Negotiators were trying to communicate with him through a PVC pipe that he'd run into the bunker, basically using it as a kind of line to the outside world without him having to come out. Police figured out he had food, electricity, and a TV down there. He was set up to hold out for a long time if he wanted to. The standoff went on for almost a week. Eventually, tactical teams went in. There was a brief exchange of fire. Dykes was killed, and the boy was thankfully rescued unharmed. Under the grounds of Scarborough Castle in North Yorkshire, England, archaeologists found a Cold War bunker that had been completely lost for decades. The castle sits overlooking the town, and buried underneath was this reinforced concrete shelter built in the 60s. It was meant to protect Royal Observer Corps volunteers in the event of a nuclear attack. Kevin Booth from English Heritage said, "Wherever you lived in Britain, you were probably no more than a few miles from an ROC post, yet few people knew they existed. It seems strange to have a Cold War bunker built inside Scarborough Castle, but in many ways, it is a perfect location." End quote. The dig started on March 7th after survey data suggested something was hidden under the castle. Once they opened it up and sent cameras in, they found cramped bunks, communication equipment, and just enough room for a small group of volunteers to ride out a nuclear blast while tracking what was happening above ground. This is one of around 1,500 bunkers like it across the UK, and most of them have been forgotten. The Royal Observer Corps had over 20,000 volunteers whose whole job was monitoring atomic explosions, and the general public barely knew any of it existed. Booth also pointed out something really cool about the location. That land has been used as a lookout point for thousands of years, going back to the Bronze Age. So in January 1981, there was a farmer in southern France named Renato Nicolai. He made a pretty bold claim. He said he watched as this disc-shaped object came down, landed in his field for a moment, and then just took off again. Now, UFO reports aren't novel. People have made them before. Most cases like this never really go anywhere, but this one was different. France had an official government group at the time that actually investigated this kind of thing. They were called GEPAN, basically a government aerospace research agency. What they found was a circular mark where the thing supposedly touched down. The soil inside that mark was packed way harder than everything around it, like something heavy had been pressing down on it. Then they tested the plants in that area. Chlorophyll levels were lower than they should be, so they weren't processing sunlight the way they normally would. The lab results seemed to show they'd been hit with some kind of intense heat or energy. None of their findings were consistent with a helicopter landing. There was also no burn marks, no chemical residue, none of the stuff you'd expect if someone had set something on fire nearby, for example. Now, they never officially came out and said this was definitely a UFO, but they didn't have a normal explanation either. The Mariana Trench is the deepest place on Earth. It's completely dark, the pressure down there would destroy most things, and almost nothing human has ever been anywhere near it. For a long time, people just assumed the deep ocean was basically untouched. Then in 2019, during a deep-sea dive using a submersible, called the limiting factor, they found a plastic bag sitting on the bottom. Ended up being one of the deepest pieces of plastic pollution ever found. And it wasn't alone. The more they researched, the more they found. Synthetic fibers and plastic fragments spread all through the deep ocean, not just near coasts or close to the surface. Ocean currents, of course, carry debris out, and tiny particles just gradually shift down from the surface over time. They found microplastics inside the bodies of deep sea animals too, which means it's not just sitting on the floor, it's entering the ecosystem. For a long time, we kind of felt like the deep sea was cut off. But it turns out it's not at all. Even the most extreme, remote place on the planet is affected by what's going on up here. In 2017, researchers at a museum in Kansas City were examining one of Van Gogh's paintings called Olive Trees. They're using magnification and imaging tools to go over the layers of paint, and buried in the surface, they found something really strange. A grasshopper. Not a painting of one, an actual insect stuck in the paint. Van Gogh painted the piece outside, so at first you think, well, okay, a bug landed in the wet paint while he was working. Makes sense. But then they looked closer. Entomologists examined the insect and worked out that it was already dead when it landed there. There were no signs it had moved or struggled after getting stuck, which, you'd expect to see if it had flown in while still alive, so it probably just fell in. Wind would have carried it, or it dropped from a nearby plant. Maybe Van Gogh put it in there on purpose for some reason. But whatever the case, it was already dead before it hit the canvas. Van Gogh actually wrote in letters about how painting outside was a constant battle with dust, bugs, and random debris landing in his work, but finding actual physical proof of that over 130 years later, it's kind of funny. Now this is kind of amazing. For a long time, if you looked at a map, you'd see Australia, New Zealand off to the side, not much else really, but over the past few decades, geologists kept running into things that didn't quite add up. In 2017, a group of scientists officially confirmed there's actually another continent in that region. They called it Zealandia. The reason nobody had caught it before is because about 94% of it is sitting underwater. The parts that break the surface are what we recognize as New Zealand and a few smaller islands nearby. What makes it a continent isn't just the size, though it is huge, about 2/3 the size of Australia, but the bigger thing is the type of crust that it's made of. It's thicker and less dense than regular ocean floor, which is one of the main ways geologists tell continental crust from oceanic crust. How it ended up mostly underwater is still something researchers are trying to work out. The general idea is that it slowly thinned and sank over millions of years, but the exact way that happened is still being debated. Scientists already knew water moves between the surface and inside of the Earth. That part wasn't new. What scientists didn't know was how much of it is actually happening. When oceanic plates slide under continents, a process called subduction, they drag material down with them. Water goes down too, but not like a river or a stream. It's locked inside minerals and rocks. Researchers found evidence of a mineral called ringwoodite deep in the mantle that can hold water, and when they started estimating how much might be down there, the numbers were massive, possibly in the ballpark of several entire oceans worth of water just sitting deep underground. And they tried to balance the math. How much water is going down versus how much is coming up through volcanoes, and more seems to be going in than coming out. So either there's a huge hidden reservoir somewhere deep in the planet that we've never been able to reach, or there are ways it's cycling back up that we haven't figured out yet. It's a pretty crazy find though, changes where we think most of the water on the planet is. We usually think, oceans, lakes, rivers, ice, but a huge chunk of it might actually be locked away inside rock. In 2020, construction crews were working on the new Felipe Angeles International Airport north of Mexico City. Keep in mind, this area used to be an ancient lake bed, so as the bulldozers started clearing the ground, they found stuff, and by stuff I mean a massive prehistoric graveyard. They dug up the remains of over 200 mammoths. The sheer number of bones was so high, they had to build a museum right there at the airport to house everything they pulled out of the dirt. Thousands of years ago, the edge of the lake was a giant mud trap, so these massive animals would walk into the shallow water, get stuck, and then eventually die. Along with the mammoths, workers found bones from ancient horses and camels, and what makes this even crazier is that archaeologists found evidence that early humans might have been using the mud to their advantage. They found pits that looked like they were dug specifically to trap these animals. So you have an airport being built over an ancient hunting ground full of extinct animal bones. Pretty much the full scope of human ingenuity and growth all in one place. Back in 2012, a group of researchers decided to look for the lost remains of King Richard III, who died in 1485. History said that he was buried in a church in Lancaster, but that church had been torn down hundreds of years ago. The area was eventually paved over and turned into a social services parking lot. When the excavators broke through the asphalt, they found a skeleton almost immediately. It wasn't just anybody. The spine was severely curved, which matched historical descriptions of the king having scoliosis. The skull showed signs of a brutal death with massive injuries from a halberd or sword. To be 100% sure, scientists tracked down a direct descendant of the king's sister, a furniture maker living in Canada, and used his DNA to confirm the identity. It's one of the most statistically impossible finds in history. For 5 centuries, people were parking their cars over the grave of one of England's most famous historical figures. During a land development farming project in the jungle of Campeche, Mexico, something massive was hiding just under the trees. For a long time, people thought this specific part of the jungle was empty, but a recent survey using LiDAR technology, which uses lasers to see through thick plants, revealed an entire hidden city. They named it Valeriana, and it's not just a few small buildings, it's huge, full of pyramids, plazas, and ball courts where the Maya used to play games. The site is actually the second largest Maya city ever found in the region. Workers and farmers had no idea. They were walking over the ruins of a city where up to 50,000 people would have lived, right in the middle of a tropical forest. Back in 2016, a construction crew was doing routine maintenance on water pipes in a park in Tomares, Spain. While digging a trench, they accidentally hit 19 large clay jars known as amphorae, the kind Romans used for shipping wine and oil. But these weren't holding any of that though. Instead, they were packed to the brim with over 1,300 pounds of mostly bronze Roman coins, some with a thin silver coating, dating from the late 3rd to early 4th century. That's an estimated 200,000 plus coins in total. A ton of them were in near mint condition too. Experts think this massive hoard was buried around 310 as a secret stash during a brutal stretch of civil wars, invasions, and skyrocketing inflation. Hoarding coins like this in industrial-sized jars was not the norm. Usually you'd find a handful in a pot, maybe. The massive amount seems to suggest someone panicked, hid it all, and never made it back, or probably killed off by raiders or rivals. In 2010, workers were building a new road in Dorset when they found a super gnarly mass grave. It contained the skeletons of 51 men. All of them had been executed. The most disturbing part was how they were buried. The bodies were tossed into a heap in a pit, which is standard. I mean, you butcher a whole bunch of people all at once, you usually dig a big hole and throw them in. But even more gruesome in this case is that all their heads were missing. Archaeologists eventually found the skulls piled in a separate stack in the corner of the grave. Analysis of the teeth showed these men were not locals, they were Vikings. They'd traveled to England to raid. It looks like they were captured by the Anglo-Saxons, stripped of their clothes, and wasted one by one. The cut marks on the neck bones showed that it was a pretty messy affair too, with a lot of the men being hacked from the front rather than the back. Ireland's peat bogs are usually good at preserving things. The environment is cold, low oxygen, and slow to break things down, which is why people have pulled wooden tools, clothing, and even human bodies out of them in remarkable condition. In 2016, a man cutting turf found a large waxy lump buried underground. It weighed around 22 pounds and turned out to be something called bog butter, which is literally just butter found in bogs. It was roughly 2,000 years old. In ancient Ireland, butter was buried in bogs for different reasons. To store it, to hide it, or possibly as some kind of offering. The reasoning isn't always clear. What is clear, though, is that even after all that time underground, the chemical structure of the fat is still pretty much the same. The smell is apparently a totally different story, though. Not anything you'd want near your food. After World War II, not every tank and armored vehicle got stored in a museum or melted down for scrap. Some of them were just buried. Across parts of the UK, construction workers and farmers have dug up tanks and other military equipment, sometimes only a few feet below the surface. In many cases, they were buried on purpose. It's just the fastest way to clear land after the war ended. Pulling them out wasn't seen as worth the effort. So some vehicles were used in training exercises or testing and got stuck or damaged badly enough that moving them just wasn't practical. The solution: push them into the ground and move on. Stuff grew over the pits over time, and eventually they looked like nothing more than a slightly uneven patch of field. So when this stuff suddenly shows up during construction, it's almost always a surprise. A seemingly completely ordinary piece of land turns out to have a World War II tank sitting right underneath it. At the very northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, there's a place called Lands aux Meadows. In the 60s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad went to investigate some unusual mounds that locals had noticed in the landscape. What they uncovered were the remains of Norse buildings, sod houses, a workshop, signs of metalworking. The site dates to around the year 1000. This was the confirmation that Norse explorers had reached North America about 500 years before Columbus. Everything had been slowly covered by layers of soil and grass over the years, blending into the landscape, well enough that nothing looked out of place from the surface. The site appears to have been used only for a short period of time, which actually helped preserve it. There just wasn't much later building or activity on top of it to disturb what was already there. In 1996, archaeologist Zahi Hawass made a major discovery in Egypt's Bahariya oasis. The site became known as the Valley of the Golden Mummies. The burials date to the Greco-Roman period, around 2,000 years ago. What's been found there so far includes hundreds of mummies, many of them decorated with gold, particularly on their faces. These were not pharaohs or royalty, though. They appear to just be middle or upper class people who had the extra money for more elaborate burials. The tombs are connected through a series of underground chambers and passageways, and they're still digging there to this day. A lot of researchers think there could be way more burials hidden underground. Some estimates get pretty high, but nothing's been fully confirmed yet. Even so, what they've already found makes it one of the biggest mummy discoveries in Egypt's history. In the early 2000s, coal miners working in an open pit mine in Colombia started turning up fossils. Some of the vertebrae they found were bigger than anything on record. Scientists eventually identified the remains as belonging to a snake called Titanoboa. It lived around 60 million years ago, shortly after the dinosaurs went extinct, and based on the fossils, it was about 13 meters long, or roughly 42 feet. That makes it the largest snake ever discovered. Some say these things could have even reached like 50 feet. Snakes are cold-blooded, which means their body size is directly tied to how warm their environment is. The hotter the climate, the larger they can grow. So safe to say it was pretty hot there back in Titanoboa's day. It lived in a dense, swampy, tropical environment, and over millions of years, the landscape slowly compressed and turned into coal. That's why its fossils ended up buried so deep, only showing up once miners started cutting into those layers.
Picture stumbling upon skeletonized remains in a building untouched for years. On January 10, 2023, human skeletal remains were discovered in a vacant residential building on the Clark Kerr campus of the University of California, Berkeley. This location is about a mile from the main campus and hosts many of the university's sports facilities. The building, part of an old residential and theater complex, had not been occupied for many years. The remains were skeletonized, and it was unclear how long that they had been there initially. The University of California Police Department and the Alameda County Coroner's Office opened investigations. There were no outstanding missing persons cases from the campus community at the time of discovery. A month later, the remains were identified as those of Joseph Edward Majica, a 42-year-old homeless man. No cause of death was determined and no foul play was suspected. What if a routine police check revealed a body in advanced decomposition? On October 6, 2023, Beaumont police discovered a decomposed body in a vacant, burned-out building in the 2100 block of Magnolia in Beaumont, Texas. The discovery occurred around 11:40 a.m. on a Friday, and the body was in the advanced stages of decomposition, making immediate identification impossible without further examination. Justice of the Peace Ben Collins pronounced the individual dead at the scene and ordered an autopsy to determine the cause of death and identity. No further details on the identity or circumstances were released publicly, but the building's vacant and damaged state from the prior fire allowed the remains to go undetected until police arrived in response to a report. The case illustrates the risks posed by a neglected urban property where such grim finds can remain hidden amid fire damage and structural instability. Imagine a fire-destroyed structure again yielding human remains amid the rubble. On January 15, 2026, a body was found inside a vacant building in North Hills, Los Angeles that had been destroyed by a fire earlier in the week. The Los Angeles Fire Department located the body on a Thursday while clearing debris. The individual was not identified and the cause of death was not specified in initial reports. The day before, on Wednesday, K9 units had detected human remains in the rubble, but no body was found at the time, leading to continued searches. The building was vacant at the time of the fire, and the blaze led to significant structural damage, creating shoulder-high rubble that required heavy machinery for removal. The fire also displaced more than 30 residents from a neighboring apartment complex, with at least 3 units yellow-tagged as unsafe by the Department of Building and Safety. Authorities continued investigating the scene to determine more about the incident and the remains. How unsettling to find a body in a place once bustling with activity but now overrun by squatters. In August 2025, a body was discovered inside an abandoned Wells Fargo bank branch on Hillcroft between Westmer and High Meadow in southwest Houston, Texas. Neighbors reported that the building had become a haven for squatters and with unauthorized entries happening almost daily through unconventional paths like broken windows or unsecured doors. The body was found that morning, but police did not disclose the cause of death, the identity, or how long it had been there. Homicide unit investigators were on the scene for hours, though foul play was not officially ruled out or confirmed. The bank had been vacated by Wells Fargo in September 2023, and since then there had been 27 complaints to the city's 311 service, including issues with standing water, high weeds, and squatting dating back to February 2024. The property owner had erected a fence after citations, but access continued unabated. Video from local news shows the exterior of the overgrown building with police presence, yellow tape, and neighbors discussing the ongoing issues with trespassing and neglect. Envision human remains concealed in a blighted warehouse for years. On October 25, 2025, human remains were discovered in an abandoned warehouse at 700 Flint Avenue in Albany, Georgia. The Albany Police Department responded to the scene promptly, and the remains were transported to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's crime lab for an autopsy. No identification was made at the time, and the cause of death remained unknown pending further analysis. According to APD Chief Michael Pursley, the decomposition indicated the body had been there for at least 2 years, possibly longer given the extent of decay. The warehouse had been unoccupied for at least 5 years, contributing to its neglected and blighted state with no regular security or maintenance. The investigation continued, but no additional details on the circumstances or potential foul play were released publicly. The discovery brought attention to the dangers of long-abandoned industrial sites in urban areas, where remains can decompose undetected over extended periods amid accumulating debris and environmental hazards. What secrets might an open door in the early hours reveal? On August 21, 2025, a body was found in an abandoned building near Northwest Jennings Avenue and West Hensley Boulevard in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Around 3:45 a.m. on that Thursday, police officers noticed an open door during a routine patrol or check and entered to clear the building as a standard procedure for unsecured vacant properties, locating the body during the process. It was unclear how long the body had been there, as no immediate signs pointed to a recent event. No foul play was suspected initially, and the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office assisted in the investigation to determine the cause of death through autopsy and other means. The identity of the deceased was not released publicly. The building's abandoned status allowed for such an undisturbed presence until the officer's routine check uncovered it. The case remained ongoing, emphasizing how vacant properties in smaller communities can become sites for unnoticed tragedies, especially when left unsecured and unmonitored. Think about a tip leading to a body in a deserted urban spot. On July 16, 2025, a woman's body was found in an abandoned property in North Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. An unknown male informed police that he had discovered the body inside the property, prompting an immediate response. Upon arrival, officers found the woman slumped off a bed with visible blood around her nose, suggesting possible trauma or medical distress. The exact address was not specified in reports, but it was described as an abandoned property in the North Philadelphia area. No identification was made at the scene, and the cause of death was not determined pending further investigation and autopsy. Police initiated an investigation, but no details on foul play or exact circumstances were provided initially. The abandoned nature of the site, likely with broken entry points and no oversight, allowed the body to remain until the tip prompted the police response. This incident underscores the prevalence of neglected neglected buildings in city neighborhoods, serving as hidden locations for such discoveries amid urban decay. How chilling to uncover a bound body in a makeshift grave. On April 10, 2025, the body of a man was discovered in a shallow grave in the basement of an abandoned Chinese restaurant at 22nd and South Streets in Center City, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The body was bound at the hands and feet and wrapped in a carpet or rug, with a shallow grave dug directly into the basement floor, indicating deliberate concealment. The discovery occurred on a Wednesday night after fire crews were dispatched around 7 p.m. to the abandoned buildings on a report of a small fire, which led to the grim finding during inspection. No identification of the man was made publicly, and the cause of death was not released, though the binding and burial methods suggested possible foul play. Police investigated the scene extensively, securing the area and processing evidence. The restaurant had been abandoned for some time, allowing for the undisturbed concealment in the basement. Video from local news shows police vehicles outside the boarded-up building, officers securing the perimeter, and forensic teams entering the property. The investigation continued to determine more about the incident and any connections. Imagine a vacant public housing structure hiding a silent end. On January 21, 2026, a man was found dead inside a vacant Philadelphia Housing Authority building in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The discovery happened on a Wednesday morning after police were called to the scene, possibly following a report or welfare check on the property. Officers confirmed the body upon entry. No foul play was suspected initially based on preliminary observations, and an investigation was launched to determine the cause of death and identity through medical examination. The building was empty at the time, with no active residents or maintenance, contributing to the body going unnoticed until reported. No further details on the circumstances, exact location within the building, or how the body was positioned were provided in initial reports. This find highlights how abandoned public facilities can become unintended resting places in urban settings, often due to a lack of security and oversight. What if an abandoned building concealed a natural passing unseen? On March 9, 2025, the body of an unidentified male was found in an abandoned building in Jackson, Mississippi. Authorities determined the victim had died of natural causes following examination. The exact location was near a reported incident, but specifics on the building were not detailed beyond its abandoned status, likely a vacant structure in a neglected area. No foul play was involved, and the investigation focused primarily on identification and confirmation of the cause through autopsy and record checks. The body had likely been there for some time before discovery, given the decomposition stage implied in such cases.
In Denmark, a team of researchers was digging through a Viking burial ground. They've been sitting untouched underground for more than 1,000 years. They were pulling up old bones and corroded tools when they found something that had absolutely no business being there. It was a small glass bottle buried in the dirt. Inside was a handwritten note. Is it a treasure map? An ancient Viking poem? Well, no. It was just a letter from a local guy named Hans, who'd worked on that exact same site back in 1895. He'd buried it on purpose as a little hello to whoever came back to finish the dig one day. It's a strange thing to find. I mean, here are these modern archaeologists surrounded by graves from the Viking Age. They're holding a 130-year-old letter from someone who was standing in the same spot doing the same work over a century before them. The note mentioned details from the original excavation and even named some of the people who were part of it. One of the archaeologists described holding it as a very special feeling, knowing that the person who wrote it was standing right there where he was standing more than 100 years earlier. Another pointed out just how unusual that kind of connection is. Their whole job is dealing with people who've been dead for, 1,000 years, so getting a note from someone who died only just over a century ago, it almost felt recent in comparison. In southeastern Turkey, there's a site called Göbekli Tepe. A survey team noted it back in 1963, but it wasn't until archaeologists Klaus Schmidt started digging in 1994 that anyone understood what was actually there. What they found was enormous stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circles and carved with images of animals, snakes, foxes, and birds. The structures go back to around 9600 BCE. That's over 11,000 years ago. Thousands of years before Stonehenge, thousands of years before the pyramids. And here's the part that makes it hard to wrap your head around. When this place was built, people were still mostly hunter-gatherers. Agriculture, as we think of it, settled farms, permanent villages, it wasn't really a thing yet. The old assumption was that civilization came first, and then you got the big structures. Göbekli Tepe flips that on its head. Somehow, people without permanent settlements were organizing in large enough numbers to plan and build something like this. There's no strong evidence that anyone actually lived here though. Best guess is that it was used for rituals or large gatherings, but they're still not exactly sure. In 2015, a farmer named James Bristol and his neighbor were digging a trench on his property in Lima Township, Michigan. They were putting in a drainage pipe about 8 feet underground when the backhoe hit something solid. They figured it was probably a rock or an old tree root, and they pulled it up. It was a bone, roughly 3 feet long. That clearly didn't come from anything living on the farm. Bristol contacted the University of Michigan Museum of Paleontology, which happened to be about 10 miles away, and a team came out to take a look. Bristol gave them 1 day. He had farming work to get back to, so they moved quickly, and what they found was a partial skeleton of a Jeffersonian mammoth, a massive animal that roamed North America until about 12,000 years ago. Michigan has had around 30 mammoth finds over the years, but this one was especially well preserved. They dug up the whole skull with its gigantic tusks. Incredibly cool find. Old cities have a habit of building right on top of their own history. In places like New York, construction crews doing underground utility work have occasionally broken through to something unexpected. Old iron safes from the 1800s, buried several feet down. It typically belonged to banks, jewelers, or other businesses. When the buildings above them were torn down, the safes were often just left behind. They were too heavy to move easily, and at the time, it wasn't worth the trouble, so workers built right over them. Most of the time when these are found and opened, they're empty, unfortunately. Whatever was inside was either cleared out before the building closed or didn't survive being underground for over a century. It's not a dramatic discovery really, but it's a good reminder of how cities work, layer after layer, generation after generation, with like older pieces of the city just sitting underneath everything that came after. Along the Pan-American Highway in northern Chile, there's a stretch of land called Cerro Ballena, which means Whale Hill. In 2010, workers expanding the road started uncovering fossilized whale skeletons. When researchers came in to investigate, they found over 40 whales, along with bones from other creatures, all in the same area. The fossils are between 6 and 9 million years old. What caught scientists' attention was how the skeletons were positioned. A lot of them were lined up in similar directions, which seems to suggest they didn't just drift in randomly. Something happened to a large number of animals at once, repeatedly. Leading theory is toxic algae blooms. These blooms can poison marine life, and if they happened multiple times in the same area, groups of whales could have died and then washed ashore together. In Redmond, Washington, a crew was working on a project to restore a salmon habitat in the middle of a busy town center. While they were digging, they started pulling up stone tools that looked really old. And when archaeologists arrived, they came across over 4,000 artifacts, including spear points, scrapers, and flakes of stone from when tools were being made. They were roughly 10,000 years old. At the time, the area was a very different place. These people were hunting bison, caribou, and maybe even mammoths as the glaciers from the last ice age were retreating. Finding something this old in the middle of a modern, developed city is extremely rare because most sites like this were destroyed by construction decades ago. These tools were made from a type of volcanic glass that wasn't local to the area either, which tells us these prehistoric hunters were traveling long distances or trading with other groups. Completely changed the timeline of when humans first settled in the Pacific Northwest. Construction projects in Europe often run into leftovers from World War II, but workers in Belgrade found something that stopped the entire city. While digging for a new building, they uncovered a massive German bomb that weighed over 2,000 pounds. And not only was it massive, it was still alive, packed with over 1,300 pounds of high-grade explosives. It was designed to level entire city blocks, and because of the age of the fuse, it was incredibly unstable. One wrong move and boom. Police had to evacuate over 1,000 people from their surrounding neighborhood and shut down several major streets. Military bomb squads had to carefully move the device to a safe location to detonate it. Pretty insane. Even though the war ended over 80 years ago, there are still dangers sitting just a few feet under the sidewalk in a lot of major cities in Europe. In 1982, an excavator operator was digging the foundations for a new shopping center in York, England. Suddenly, he felt his machine hit something metal, so he stopped to check. Well, he'd accidentally struck a 1,200-year-old Anglo-Saxon helmet. The machine dented the metal slightly, but the helmet was almost perfectly preserved because it had been buried in a wood-lined pit that kept the oxygen out. The helmet was made of iron and brass with intricate carvings and a Latin inscription, a prayer for the man wearing it. It's one of only 6 Anglo-Saxon helmets ever found, and it's the best preserved of the bunch. Before this find, most of what we knew about this type of armor came from drawings in old books, so seeing a physical, real-life version was a massive deal for historians. It ended up being the centerpiece of the local museum, and remains one of the most important Viking-era finds in the UK. Washington Square Park in New York City is one of the most famous spots in Manhattan, but in 2015, workers doing a water main project found out that the park is literally built on top of the dead. They broke into 2 vaulted brick burial chambers that had been hidden for nearly 200 years. Inside were the skeletal remains of at least 20 people, with wooden coffins stacked on top of each other. History shows this area was used as a potter's field, a graveyard for the poor and victims of yellow fever between 1797 and 1825. It's estimated that there are up to 20,000 people buried under the park. Most of the gravestones were removed when it was turned into a park in the mid-1800s, so people forgot exactly where the bodies were. Now, thousands of people walk and sit and play on top of these forgotten catacombs every single day without realizing what's right beneath their feet. And during a construction project in Pennsylvania, workers were clearing land when they found a trench filled with human remains. Fortunately, this wasn't a crime scene though, just a mass grave from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Now, during that time, the virus was wiping people out so fast at funeral homes and cemeteries, they just couldn't keep up. So in some towns, the death rate was so high they had to use steam shovels to dig long trenches just to get the bodies underground as quickly as possible to stop the spread of disease. The people in this grave were likely victims who didn't have family left to claim them, or from families too poor to afford a plot. And because of the chaos of the pandemic, a lot of these emergency burial sites were just not properly recorded on city maps. So as the decades went on, the town grew, and people eventually forgot the trenches were even there. In 1963, a man in Turkey was doing some routine renovation work in his basement when he grabbed a sledgehammer and started knocking down a wall. The moment the wall crumbled, he saw something that he was never expecting to see. Behind the stone was a pitch-black opening, and when he followed it, he realized he wasn't just in a tunnel, he was in a massive underground tunnel leading to an ancient city called Derinkuyu. And when I say underground city, I really mean it. This was not a small cave or a storage room. It's a whole network of rooms and pathways carved directly into the rock, stretching hundreds of feet below the surface. The scale of the place, it's hard to wrap your head around. It had 18 levels, was built to shelter up to 20,000 people at a time. It had everything a real city needs to function: kitchens, stables for animals, chapels, and schools, all connected by these narrow hallways. Even had a genius ventilation system with shafts that channeled fresh air all the way down to the bottom levels. They used giant circular stone doors that could only be locked from the inside to block off intruders. For hundreds of years, the people living on the surface had no idea that this entire city was sitting right below their feet. In 2013, a California couple was taking their dog for a walk on their property when they noticed something strange sticking out of the dirt near an old tree. It was a rusted metal can, mostly buried and covered in grime. At first, they probably thought it was just some old trash that someone had dumped decades ago, but when they pried open the lid, they found gold coins inside. They went back to the same spot with a metal detector and started scanning the area, and before long, they were digging up 7 more cans. Inside those cans were thousands of gold coins, dating back to the late 1800s, all in near perfect condition. This is now known as the Saddle Ridge Hoard, and it was estimated to be worth around $10 million. Nobody knows for sure who put the coins there, but historians think a wealthy person didn't trust the banking system and decided to bury their life savings in the dirt. Obviously, it never came back for them. The couple had walked past that specific tree for years without realizing that they were stepping on a literal fortune. In early 2026, construction workers in Hull, England were in the middle of a routine excavation for a new water tank in Queen's Gardens when they hit something incredibly hard. They assumed it was a rock or some old foundation, but then they cleared away the mud and they realized they were staring at a huge cast iron cannon. It was over 8 feet long and weighed more than 2,200 pounds. It had been buried underground for centuries, and historians believe it dates back to the late 1600s. Back in that era, this area of the city was part of a major fortified dockyard. As the city grew and warfare changed, the old fortifications were torn down and the land was leveled to make room for new buildings. Instead of the massive back-breaking job job of hauling that heavy cannon away, the construction crews at the time just dumped it in a hole and paved right over it. So it sat there for 300 years while the city transformed around it. When a company started construction on a new hotel in Alexandria, Virginia back in 2015, they were not expecting to find a piece of the high seas in their foundation. While they were digging out the dirt for the basement levels, crew kept hitting large curved pieces of timber. It looked like someone had just dropped a huge wooden frame in the mud. As it turned out, that was sort of the case. It was the remains of a merchant ship from the 1700s. In the 18th century, people didn't have the same environmental laws that we have today, obviously, and when a ship got too old, damaged to sail, it wasn't always scrapped or taken to a shipyard. Often it was just dragged to the shoreline and sunk on purpose. It filled the boat with rocks and dirt to create new solid land, which helped the city expand its waterfront. So over time, the city just grew out over the hulls of these ships. The one they found in Alexandria is remarkably well preserved because it was buried in wet, oxygen-free mud that prevented the wood from rotting. So archaeologists had to move at an incredible pace to dismantle the ship piece by piece, trying to preserve the wood before it just dried out and crumbled. A maintenance crew in Scotland was doing some routine repairs on the old Ruthven Bridge a few years back when they pulled a loose stone out of the foundation. Sitting in a small hollowed-out space inside the masonry was a metal box. Turned out it was a time capsule left by the bridge's original builders way back in 1894. Inside the box, they found a local newspaper from the exact day the bridge was finished, a handwritten scroll with the names of every worker who built it, and a bottle of scotch. It was a tradition for builders at the time to leave a little something behind for future generations, a way of saying, we were here. While the paper and the scroll were gold for historians, the bottle of whiskey, that was definitely the prize. A literal taste of the 1890s, showing exactly how the drink was made more than 100 years ago. In September 2024, the research vessel RV Blue Heron was in a Cleveland shipyard for some routine repairs. While the crew was working on a noisy propeller shaft, they noticed something really strange. A black tar-like goo oozing out of the rudder post. It wasn't grease, it didn't smell like oil. When they tried to light it with a blowtorch, it didn't burn. Doug Ricketts, the marine superintendent at the Large Lakes Observatory, collected a sample and brought it back to the lab, asking, quote, "Think you guys could do anything with this?" Well, that question turned into one of the most surprising discoveries the team has seen. When they finally ran tests on the goo, they found it was full of life. Not just a few microbes, but a whole bunch of different kinds living in there. Some were types already known from tar pits or oil wells, but at least two of them were totally new to science. The goo turned out to be a tiny little ecosystem. The researchers are calling it Ship Goo 01, and they're still trying to figure out how it got there and how it survives. In 2025, the James Webb Space Telescope spotted something weird. Astronomers noticed a tiny red speck of light that didn't act like anything they'd seen before. They named it Capitaro, after an old Italian mountain, and tagged it as CEERS U100588. At first it looked like, just a faint blob sitting out there in the sky, but when they looked closer, its brightness and color was unusual. If it's what it looks like, this little speck could be a galaxy from just 90 million years after the Big Bang. That'd be way earlier than anything else we've ever confirmed. But it also might not even be a galaxy. Some think it could be a brown dwarf, basically a failed star floating somewhere in our own galaxy. Scientists still aren't sure. The telescope saw it in some infrared filters, but not in others, so it's kind of stuck in limbo. But this could be a really exciting discovery. This bizarre-looking creature was just recently discovered deep in the South American rainforest. Scientists led by entomologist Rudolf Schafran from the University of Florida came across a soldier termite with a head unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It's long and bulbous. It almost looks like a whale, so much so that researchers named it Cryptotermesis mobidicki, a nod to Moby Dick, of course. What makes this termite so bizarre isn't just the size of its head, though. Its jaws are hidden far back, tucked inside the head, which gives it a completely different look from any termite species we've seen before. This species is now the 16th known member of the Cryptotermes genus in South America. For hundreds of years, people have looked at the moon and seen weird things happen on its surface. Sudden flashes, brief glows, faint color changes that last seconds to minutes. Astronomers call these events transient lunar phenomenon, or TLPs. and there are thousands of recorded sightings from all over the world, stretching back hundreds and hundreds of years. Some of the flashes are very quick, like a tiny burst of light that shows up for just a split second. Those are pretty well explained because the moon has no atmosphere. Small rocks and dust from space slam into its surface all the time, unlike on Earth where meteors burn up in the air. So these objects hit the moon directly at high speed and make a brief flash when they hit. Projects like NASA and the ESA's high-speed impact monitoring have actually caught hundreds of these flashes with cameras, but not all of these strange lights disappear instantly. Some glows last a minute or more, and scientists still don't have a perfect explanation for those. One idea is that tiny amounts of gas deep under the moon's crust occasionally escape through cracks, and when that gas interacts with sunlight or dust, it can create a faint glow that we can see from Earth. Even with modern telescopes and cameras, these flashes are unpredictable and hard to catch in real time, which makes them tricky to study. That's why, even in 2025, they're still a bit mysterious. Some are easy to explain, others are genuinely puzzling. Scientists just captured a really strange form of water in an experiment. It's like a solid and liquid at the same time. We all know that water turns into ice when it freezes, but deep inside giant planets like Uranus and Neptune, pressures and temperatures are so insane that water behaves a little differently. In experiments published in Nature Communications in December of 2025, researchers used the world's most powerful X-ray lasers and slammed tiny samples of water with shock waves, squeezing them to about 1.8 million times the pressure we have on Earth and heating them up to thousands of degrees. Under those conditions, the oxygen atoms lock into a solid crystal, but the hydrogen atoms don't stay still. They flow around like liquid. It's like having a rigid scaffolding full of flowing water all at once. This form of water, sometimes called super-ionic water, had been predicted by computer models, but this is the clearest real-world evidence yet. And what's cool about this is that scientists think this strange water probably fills huge parts of Uranus and Neptune, and it might be part of why those planets have magnetic fields that don't look like Earth's at all. For decades, scientists have been confused about the Earth's inner core. Seismic waves from earthquakes didn't behave the way researchers would expect them to. The core should be solid iron, but the waves moved like something inside was a little bit soft or flowing. Nobody could figure out why. In 2025, a team of researchers in China tried to solve the mystery. They recreated the extreme conditions of the inner core in a lab, super high pressure and heat, similar to what's found 3,000 kilometers underground. They used a mix of iron and carbon and blasted it with shock waves. Instead of staying completely solid, the carbon atoms started moving through the iron like a liquid, while the iron stayed solid. This is called a super-ionic state. Again, it explains the weird seismic readings. The moving carbon makes the inner core softer to certain vibrations, exactly like what would happen with an earthquake. But the point is, we now know that the inner core of our planet isn't just solid iron like scientists previously thought. In 2015, road workers in Huiyan, China were in the middle of a standard job carrying up a street to fix a broken pipe when they hit this layer of hard, round objects. They're about to keep digging when they realized these weren't stones, they were fossilized dinosaur eggs. They ended up finding 43 eggs in that one single spot, and 19 of them were in near perfect condition, somehow surviving the weight of the asphalt and the traffic. Now, this specific part of China is actually known as a hotspot for fossils, but finding fossilized eggs directly under a busy city street, that was completely unexpected. You have to think about the people who drove over that road every single day. Thousands of commuters going to work or heading home were driving their cars back and forth over the remains of a dinosaur nursery. Back in 2011, road workers in Taizhou, China were widening a street when their shovel hit something wooden. They stopped the job immediately, and when the archaeologists arrived, they realized they'd found a coffin from the Ming Dynasty. This woman had been buried roughly 700 years before, but she hadn't decayed the way that you would expect. The coffin was layered, and when they opened the innermost box, there were more than just bones. Her skin was still soft, her clothes were perfectly intact. The secret was this mysterious dark brown liquid that the coffin was filled with. It acted like a natural preservative, sealing her away from the air. A man in the UK was digging a few holes in his garden to put up a new fence when he uncovered a heavy, dark rock that had a really strange texture. He pulled it out, set it aside, didn't really think much of it for a long time. He actually kept the rock in his garden shed for 16 years. It wasn't until 2013 that he finally decided to show it to a local expert, and the news he got back was incredible. It wasn't a rock at all, it was a vertebrae from a plesiosaur. These were massive, terrifying marine reptiles that hunted in the oceans during the time of the dinosaurs. They had huge heads, short necks, and 4 massive flippers that they used to zip through the water to hunt their prey. The specific bone he found belonged to a creature that would have been longer than a school bus. The fossil had survived millions of years, only to be found by someone trying to fix a fence in his backyard. When construction crews were digging in London to build the new headquarters of a massive financial firm, found something that completely stopped the project. The remains of an ancient Roman temple. It was dedicated to the god Mithras, a figure worshipped by this mysterious cult-like group that was very popular among Roman soldiers. His temple dated back to around 240 CE, and it's been buried under feet of mud and debris as the city changed over the last 2,000 years. It was preserved so well, they even found a wooden tablet with some of the oldest handwritten documents in London's history, and now you can walk through the ruins. They've been restored and integrated right into the base of the modern office building. So you can walk from a high-tech office lobby where people are like trading stocks on their computers and then directly into a temple that was built 1800 years ago. Deep inside salt mines across Europe, miners have occasionally come across salt mummies. These are exactly what they sound like, remains of prehistoric people who were perfectly preserved by the salt in the walls of the tunnels. Because salt is so good at absorbing moisture, it pulls the water out of everything it touches. Even if someone died in a salt mine thousands of years ago, they can be pretty well preserved. Granted, they're like a dried out, leathery version of themselves, but they're not just bones. These finds are always startling because the clothing, the hair, their skin, and the tools they were carrying are often still intact. So when modern miners have been fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to come across these bodies, they often say they look like a person who's just fallen asleep. In 1933, an archaeological dig in the Toluca Valley of Mexico yielded a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical community: a small terracotta head that looked like it belonged in the heart of Rome, not a Mesoamerican burial ground. This artifact features distinctly European facial features and a hairstyle typical of the Roman Severan period. It was found in a grave site that had remained undisturbed since before the Spanish conquest, and thermoluminescence testing dated the head back to the 2nd century CE. Mainstream history maintains that the first contact between Europe and the Americas happened in 1492, yet this tiny face suggests a Roman vessel may have drifted across the Atlantic more than a millennium earlier. Whether it was a shipwreck crew or a lost trade voyage, the Roman head of Mexico challenges the narrative of the New World being isolated from the Old. The Cumbia culture of Colombia, thriving around 1000 CE, left behind a series of exquisite gold figurines that have baffled aeronautical engineers for decades. While archaeologists officially categorize these objects as stylized birds or insects, their physical characteristics tell a different story. They possess delta wings, vertical stabilizers, and fuselage shapes that are almost identical to modern fighter jets. The mystery deepened when researchers built scaled-up replicas of these gold flyers, equipped them with remote-controlled engines, and then launched them, and the results were amazing. The designs were actually perfectly aerodynamic and capable of sophisticated flight. So this raises the question of whether ancient South American cultures were observing real flying craft, or if they had discovered the principles of aviation long before the Wright brothers ever took to the sky. Hidden deep beneath the sands of Egypt lies the Serapeum of Saqqara, a labyrinth of tunnels containing 24 massive granite boxes. These are not your average stone coffins. Each box weighs up to 100 tons, and they're carved from solid Aswan granite, and it's one of the hardest stones on Earth. The level of craftsmanship is what truly defies logic. The interior and exterior surfaces are finished with such mathematical precision that they're flat to within a few microns, a feat that would require advanced machinery today. Mainstream Egyptology suggests they were built to house sacred Apis bulls, yet many of the boxes were found empty or unfinished. The effort required to transport these megaliths through narrow underground tunnels, achieved such a high degree of polish suggests the ancient Egyptians possessed a technology or a purpose that we have just yet to discover. Located in the state of Paraíba, Brazil, the Inga stone is one of the most significant and mysterious archaeological monuments in the world. So this massive rock formation is covered in hundreds of these complex, undecipherable carvings that wrap around its surface. Now, unlike standard petroglyphs, the symbols on the Inga stone are incredibly detailed, depicting what many researchers believe are star charts, the Milky Way, and complex mathematical equations. Some theorists suggest the stone serves as an ancient astronomical record, tracking celestial events with high precision, and the sheer volume and sophistication of the carvings implies that a highly literate or scientifically advanced culture inhabited the Amazon basin long before recorded history, leaving behind a stone hard drive of data that modern scholars are still struggling to crack. Found in 1872 by workers digging a fence post in New Hampshire, the Lake Winnipesaukee Mystery Stone is a dark, egg-shaped relic, remains a total enigma. It's intricately carved with a variety of symbols, including a human face, an ear of corn, a wigwam, suggesting an indigenous origin. But the most baffling features are the holes bored into the top and bottom of the stone. Laboratory analysis shows these holes were drilled with incredible precision using tools that seem a lot more advanced than the Stone Age technology available to local tribes in the 19th century. Boreholes are perfectly straight and consistent in diameter, leading some to wonder if the stone is a prehistoric artifact or perhaps a piece of technology from a forgotten civilization that once roamed the North American Northeast. In the middle of what used to be the Aral Sea sat Vozrozhdenia Island. During the Cold War, it housed the Soviet Union's Aralsk 7 bioweapons facility. From the 50s until 1992, they tested pathogens like anthrax, plague, and tularemia there. They tested nasty stuff, weaponized anthrax, plague, and smallpox, chaining monkeys and other animals to stakes for open-air explosions to see how everything would spread in the wind. Labs churned out tons of the bacteria, grown in huge vats. When the USSR collapsed, the whole operation got abandoned and left behind. Burial pits ended up being filled with stainless steel drums of live spores just shoved into the ground without proper sealing. Meanwhile, the Aral Sea was shrinking because rivers feeding it had been diverted for irrigation, and by the early 2000s, the island wasn't really an island anymore. It became connected to the mainland by dry seabed, and now there was this fear that rodents would start to move in and potentially carry pathogens out, spreading them to the mainland. US inspection teams in the 90s cracked open pits and found anthrax still kicking after decades underground. Journalists who snuck in also described lab rooms with shattered glass vials and half-buried plague-infected sheep skeletons poking out from the sand. A 2002 cleanup effort bleached over 300 hectares and poured concrete on some of the most contaminated spots. From 1952 to 1989, Rocky Flats near Denver produced the plutonium cores for US nuclear weapons. These were the triggers inside hydrogen bombs. Rocky Flats was one of the most secretive facilities in the country. But in 1989, the FBI raided it. Helicopters circled overhead while agents carried out search warrants. Investigators were looking into illegal waste handling. Allegations included the burning of plutonium-contaminated materials in an incinerator and the improper storage of radioactive waste. Over the years, the site had experienced fires and accidental releases. Contamination had spread beyond the boundaries of the plant in the past, including a major plutonium fire in 1957. Cleanup ultimately cost billions of dollars. By 1996, the plant was shut down permanently, and crews tore down all the 385 buildings. People living in Westminster and Broomfield noticed clusters of leukemia back in the 80s and 90s, and state health records link at least 10 extra cases a year to dust drifting from the site. Every now and then, the wind kicks up tiny traces from spots that never fully got cleaned. The Hanford site in Washington state produced plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb and later supplied material for much of the US nuclear arsenal. Left behind 177 underground tanks holding roughly 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste. Over time, more than 60 have been confirmed to have leaked waste into the ground. Beyond leaks, workers have reported exposure to chemical chemical vapors rising from the tanks. Since the 2010s, dozens of workers reported symptoms like nosebleeds, breathing issues, and skin irritation. The Department of Energy has acknowledged vapor releases in more recent years, but for a long time, the problem was downplayed, if not just outright ignored. Cleanup at Hanford is one of the most expensive environmental efforts in U.S. history, costing billions of dollars a year. From 1948 to 1958, the U.S. ran 43 nuclear tests around Eniwetok Atoll, blasting islands apart and leaving behind huge piles of radioactive dirt, debris, and bomb parts. In 1979, crews dumped all that mess into a giant crater on Runnet Island, poured a concrete dome over it. There was no waterproof liner underneath, just gravel, so it was basically radioactive sludge sealed under concrete. Problem is, rising seas have been splashing over the dome every year, slowly cracking it, bringing all that plutonium into the lagoon. Tests found levels that are far too high for drinking water. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visited in 2019 and called it a coffin, one that's unfortunately leaking. People on nearby islands are also getting extra radiation doses from the leftover fallout. Crabs in the lagoon are so contaminated that people avoid eating them. The Department of Energy admits they never built the dome to handle rising sea levels. Not far from Chernobyl's reactor 4, there's a place called Rosoka. After the 1986 explosion, hundreds of vehicles used in the immediate response were brought here. Fire trucks that drove in the initial blaze, helicopters that dropped sand and boron over the reactor, armored vehicles that pushed radioactive debris off rooftops. Once they were too contaminated to safely use, they were stripped of salvageable parts and left in rows. Some were later buried in trenches to reduce surface radiation. Throughout the 90s, though, scavengers slipped past patrols. They would torch tires for rubber and haul frames to scrapyards outside the zone. Some of that metal wound up melted into rebar for Kiev apartments and factories. Thankfully, tighter fences and cameras went up in the 2010s. Today, much of the heavy equipment has been dismantled or reburied, but parts of the graveyard still exist in more controlled areas. Excavating it all would kick up a dust cloud of radioactive particles, though, so it mostly just stays sunk where it is, slowly rusting under trees. In the heart of New Zealand's Kaimanawa Forest, a structure exists that threatens to rewrite the history of the South Pacific. The Kaimanawa Wall consists of a series of perfectly squared, symmetrical stone blocks that appear to be a part of a larger masonry project. Precision of the joints, referred to as ashlar masonry, is strikingly similar to the megalithic walls found at Machu Picchu in Peru. While government geologists claim the wall is a natural volcanic rock formation that just cracked in a geometric pattern, a lot of independent researchers argue the symmetry is just too perfect to be an accident of nature. If the wall's man-made, it would mean that a civilization with advanced masonry skills occupied New Zealand thousands of years before the Maori people arrived, though, pointing to a lost chapter of human migration. The Meister print is perhaps one of the most controversial fossils ever discovered. Found in 1968 near Antelope Springs, Utah, this slab of slate appears to show a human sandal print, crushing 2 small trilobites. This is an impossibility by the standards of modern science, as trilobites became extinct roughly 250 million years ago, long before the first humans, let alone the invention of footwear. While a lot of geologists dismiss the artifact as a spall, a natural geological fracture that happens to resemble a footprint, the visual evidence is pretty startling. It shows a clear heel and toe, with the trilobites positioned right where a foot would have stepped. For proponents of forbidden archaeology, this artifact suggests that the timeline of human existence on Earth may be vastly older than the fossil record currently allows. While the story of Christopher Columbus is taught in schools, the main penny, also known as the Goddard coins, offered tangible proof of a much earlier European presence in the Americas. So this small silver coin was discovered in 1957 at an indigenous archaeological site in Maine. After years of study, it was identified as a Norwegian penny, minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre between 1067 and 1093 CE. This find, combined with the discovery of the Norse settlement at Lanzo Meadows in Newfoundland, confirms that the Vikings were not only visiting North America, but were probably engaging in trade networks with indigenous peoples hundreds of years before the 15th century. It is a small piece of silver that effectively rewrote the history of global exploration. Discovered in the tomb of Prince Sabu in Saqqara, the Sabu disc looks like it belongs in a modern industrial factory rather than an Egyptian tomb from 3000 BCE. Carved from rock that is notoriously brittle and difficult to work with, this disc features 3 thin, curved lobes that resemble a high-tech propeller or a turbine fan. Its design is unlike anything else found in the first dynasty of Egypt. There are no known religious or ritualistic explanations for its shape, and it appears to serve a mechanical purpose. Some theorists suggest it may have been part of a larger machine, maybe used for water propulsion or chemical mixing, which would imply the ancient Egyptians had a grasp of fluid dynamics and mechanical engineering that we have barely begun to document. Nan Madol is an architectural wonder located on the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia. It's an entire city built atop 92 artificial islets, constructed using over 250 million tons of massive basalt columns. These stone logs were transported from the other side of the island and stacked in a lattice pattern to create walls and buildings. Some of the individual stones weigh as much as 50 tons. Local legends claim that the city was built by twin sorcerers who used magic to fly the stones into place. Even today, engineers can't provide a clear explanation of how a small isolated island population managed to move such huge weight across coral reefs and rough ocean waters without the use of wheels, pulleys, or metal tools. Nan Madol remains a haunting testament to a level of logistical and engineering skills that seems impossible for its time and place. In July 2025, astronomers spotted a comet that wasn't from around here. It came from another star system entirely. They named it 3I Atlas, and it's only the 3rd confirmed interstellar object to ever visit our solar system. At first, it looked like a normal comet, but then telescopes caught something strange. As the sun warmed up, it glowed bright green, a color caused by gases escaping from the surface. The cloud of gas surrounding 3I Atlas contains huge amounts of methanol, far more than what's normal for comets from our own solar system. That suggests it formed in a super cold, unusual environment around its original star. Because it's moving so fast and won't stick around, astronomers have only a brief window to study it. But every time scientists look at it, they learn a little more about how comets and planets can form around other stars, which might work totally differently than our own solar system. This tiny interstellar visitor can tell us a lot about what conditions are like billions of miles away. And because it's so unlike the comets we're used to, it's forcing researchers to rethink some of the stuff they thought they already knew about how these icy objects form. In 2025, paleontologists made an incredible find in China. A fossil of a tiny animal called a yauti, about the size of a poppy seed, that's roughly 520 million years old. Shockingly though, its internal organs were preserved, something you just almost never see in fossils this old. Using 3D scanning technology, researchers could see things like parts of its brain, its gut, even its basic circulatory system. Normally, stuff like that decays before it ever gets fossilized, so almost every fossil that old is just bones or shells. Studying it gives researchers a really rare look at how early animals were actually built on the inside, and that's pretty cool. In 2025, scientists pulled off one of the wildest rediscoveries in modern zoology. Deep in the forests of New Guinea, they found 2 marsupial species that were believed to have gone extinct around 6,000 years ago. One is the pygmy long-fingered possum, a tiny marsupial with a super long 4th finger that it uses to dig insect larvae out of logs. The other is the ring-tailed glider, a small tree dweller that glides between branches. Until now, both species were known only from fossils, and scientists figured it vanished at the end of the last ice age. On Mars, back in 2024, NASA's Perseverance rover made a discovery that had scientists genuinely excited. In Jezero Crater, an old river valley where water once flowed, the rover found a rock that contains organic compounds, the same kinds of molecules that make up the building blocks of life. Even more interesting, the way the chemicals are arranged in the rock looks a lot like patterns created by microbes on Earth, which is why researchers think it could be one of the clearest signs yet of possible ancient life on Mars. There's no proof anything lived there for sure, but it's a big hint. Scientists are hoping to bring samples back to Earth to study them more closely. The fact that this rock comes from a place where water used to be is a big deal too, because water is one of the most important ingredients for life. So this rock could end up being one of the closest things we've ever seen to actual life beyond Earth. Back in 1986, the Chernobyl meltdown blasted the nearby pine forest with so much radiation that the needles turned bright red and the trees died off in days. And that's where the name comes from, the Red Forest. This 10 square kilometer stretch, part of the bigger exclusion zone straddling Ukraine and Belarus, still holds onto those dead trees and leaves pretty much intact even after 40 years. Normal decay happens because microbes and fungi break down organic matter, but radiation levels here wiped out most of those decomposers or messed with their DNA so bad it just can't function right. Walk through it today and you'll see piles of 1986 needles that look fresh just sitting there on the ground. The real problem hits during dry summers when wildfires spark up, and they do pretty regularly. In 2020 alone, fires burned over 8,600 hectares in the zone, kicking up plumes of smoke loaded with leftover radioactive particles, which then traveled hundreds of kilometers and dropped back down with rain, spreading contamination to places like Kiev and other parts of Europe. Monitoring stations picked up spikes as far as Sweden during those fires. From 1949 to 1989, the Soviet Union used a stretch of Kazakhstan as its primary nuclear testing ground, the Semipalatinsk test site. Locals called it the Polygon. Over those 40 years, 456 nuclear weapons were detonated there, some underground, many atmospheric, especially early on. The uncomfortable part is that villages were sitting right in the fallout paths. More than 1 million people lived in the surrounding area during those decades, and for years nobody evacuated them, even though fallout was drifting across farms. Animals grazed on contaminated grass, kids were outside during detonations that shook windows miles away. By the late 80s, Kazakh researchers were publishing data showing elevated cancer rates, especially thyroid cancer and leukemia. Reports also documented higher rates of birth defects compared to non-exposed areas. The site covers around 18,500 square kilometers. Some areas still test positive for plutonium contamination today. Kazakhstan officially shut it down in 1991. In October 1952, Britain wanted to know what would happen if a nuclear bomb went off inside a ship in a harbor, so they staged it. They anchored an old ship, HMS Plym, off the Montbello Islands in Western Australia, placed a 25 kiloton plutonium device inside the hull, and detonated it. The ship didn't survive in any recognizable form. Steel was vaporized, other sections twisted and fused into these strange glassy fragments that scattered across the seabed and nearby islands. Divers later documented debris fields in the lagoon. Cleanup operations in the 90s removed larger pieces, but not everything. There's still plutonium contamination. Access to parts of the islands are restricted. Visitors are warned not to pick up metal fragments that they might find. How long will it take to go away? Well, plutonium-239 has a half-life of about 24,000 years, so whatever is still there, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. In the 50s and early 60s, Britain carried out 7 major nuclear tests at Maralinga in South Australia, along with hundreds of smaller trials. But one of the most disturbing events actually happened earlier in 1953 during the Operation Totem tests. That was a 9 kiloton detonation. The fallout plume didn't behave the way planners expected though. It drifted straight over Aboriginal communities. People later described a strange black mist rolling in after the blast. It burned their eyes, made them vomit, skin blistered. A man named Yemi Lester, who was a child at the time, said he went blind after being caught in that fallout. He spent decades campaigning for recognition of what happened. A royal commission in 1985 found that safety procedures were very flawed, and that the indigenous people living nearby were not properly warned or protected. Some families unknowingly camped in contaminated craters afterward. Animals were hunted and eaten from areas where stuff had settled into the soil. Cleanup didn't begin seriously until the 90s. Contaminated soil was scraped up and buried, but plutonium particles were scattered across wide areas. Even today, some zones are still restricted. During World War II, Britain wanted to test biological weapons, so between 1942 and 1943, they chose a small island off the coast of Scotland called Grunard. They tethered sheep to stakes and detonated explosives packed with anthrax spores. The test proved the weapon worked. The problem was the spores stayed. Anthrax can survive in soil for decades under the right conditions. After the test, the island was declared off limits. In 1981, activists from a group calling themselves the Dark Harvest Commandos secretly landed there. They collected soil samples and sent them to labs. The spores were still viable nearly 40 years later. That stunt forced the government to finally take action, and from 1983 to 1986, crews soaked the topsoil in a formaldehyde solution and removed the heavily contaminated layers. Afterwards, sheep were reintroduced as a test, and these ones survived, so the island was officially declared safe in 1990. Safe. In 2000, two brothers were drilling a new tunnel about 1,000 feet underground in Mexico's Nica mine. They were after silver and lead, but when they broke through a wall, they found something that looked like it was from a completely different planet. The cave was packed with these enormous white crystals, some of the biggest ever found anywhere on Earth. Pillars that are 36 feet long and weigh up to 55 tons each. It looks like something out of a fantasy movie. But as beautiful as it looks, you can never just wander in there for a look around. The temperature sits at around 58 degrees Celsius or 136 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity so close to 100% that a person only lasts about 10 minutes before things get really dangerous. Stay longer and moisture starts condensing inside your lungs. You essentially drown while not actually submerged in water. It's really strange. The crystals got as big as they are because the cave had sat completely underwater in mineral-rich water for 500,000 years, with a pool of magma just underneath slowly cooking everything from below. So when the mining company pumped the water out to dig more tunnels, they accidentally revealed the whole thing. Miners in a South Africa silver mine kept pulling up these small metallic balls embedded in the rock around them. They're called the Klerksdorp spheres, usually about an inch or two across. What really gets people is the three perfectly parallel grooves running around the middle of each one. They look like something intentionally carved. They're almost alien looking. They didn't look like they'd been sitting in a rock for 1 billion years, but the rock they came out of is around 3 billion years old. So this set off a huge debate. Some people were convinced these were proof of a civilization that existed long before the dinosaurs ever showed up. But when researchers cut them open, there was nothing inside. The material crumbled to dust the second it hit air. Geologists said they're concretions, which is just what happens when minerals slowly settle into gaps in sandy sediment and harden over millions of years. Even with that explanation out there, the precision of those grooves and the fact that the spheres are balanced well enough to spin on a flat surface still makes them one of the most talked about finds in mining history. Deep inside an old quarry in central France, explorers found dozens of vintage cars from the 30s just sitting in the dark, some stacked right on top of each other, slowly falling apart in the underground damp. Nobody in the nearby town ever talked about them. They were just completely forgotten. The most likely story goes back to the beginning of World War II. When the German army moved into France, they were known for grabbing civilian vehicles, either stripping them for parts or melting them down. So the townspeople drove their cars as deep into the mine as they could, somewhere soldiers would never think to look. The problem is the war went on for years. The cars sat there getting older and rustier, and some of the owners just never came back to get them. They stayed in the dark for over 70 years until miners and explorers came across the whole graveyard. By then, the metal had gotten so bad that trying to tow them out would have caused them to just fall apart on the spot. The Mopane gold mine in South Africa goes for more than 2 miles straight down. At that depth, the rock around you radiates heat like an oven. But in 2008, scientists found that the miners aren't the only living things down there. Sitting inside water-filled cracks in the rock, they found a species of bacteria that had been completely cut off from the surface for millions of years. They called it the Terminator. It doesn't need sunlight, oxygen, or anything that exists above ground. It survives by feeding off radioactive decay. The rocks in the mine contain uranium, and as that uranium breaks down naturally over time, it splits water molecules apart. The bacteria grabs the energy from that process and uses it to stay alive. It's a whole self-sufficient ecosystem. And this discovery really made scientists think about potential life on other planets because it proved that living things don't necessarily need a warm, breathable surface to survive. Apparently, they can live deep inside what looks like completely dead rock. rock. In 1905, a mine manager named Frederick Wells spotted a faint glint of light about 18 feet below the surface of a South African mine. He climbed down and pulled out what he thought was just a big chunk of glass somebody had stuck there as a joke. It was the Cullinan diamond, 3,106 carats, about the size of a human heart, and so clear it had this bluish white tint. Still the largest gem quality diamond ever found. But the find itself isn't even the best part of this story, because it was worth an unimaginable amount of money. Everyone was expecting there'd be a heist, so the authorities pulled the oldest trick in the book. They diverted attention away from the real diamond with a decoy. They put a fake stone in a heavy safe and loaded it onto a steamship surrounded by armed guards, specifically to pull attention away from the real thing. Meanwhile, the actual diamond was just wrapped in a plain brown paper box and sent through the regular mail. And it worked. It made it all the way to London without a single problem. The Labrie Tar Pits in California is famous for its remains of Ice Age animals like mammoths, direwolves, saber-toothed cats. What most people don't know is that they also found a human skeleton here. In 1914, workers discovered partial human remains that researchers later nicknamed the Labrie Woman. She'd been dated to around 9,000 years ago. Tar pits exist because petroleum seeps up through the cracks in the earth. Those cracks formed because the ground in Southern California has been shifting and moving for millions of years. But the Labrie Woman probably wasn't trapped there like the animals were. Researchers think she was intentionally buried at the site. Why? Who the hell knows? But out of the thousands of animal fossils across the whole site, she's the only human ever found there. Mount Etna in Sicily has been erupting for thousands of years, but people kept building towns on its slopes anyway. Archaeologists have dug up Roman and later settlements buried under hardened lava. They've found walls, streets, burials, all locked under layers of what was once molten rock. Etna doesn't always go up in a massive explosion. A lot of the time it just sends rivers of lava downhill slowly, pushing over everything in its path. Towns have been swallowed like that over the centuries, but lava doesn't preserve things the way ash does. It burns and crushes first and then cools into solid rock. So when researchers dig into old lava fields and find remains of buildings underneath, those weren't already abandoned places. They were active communities that just happened to be in the wrong spot. On the island of Santorini, archaeologists found an entire Bronze Age city called Akrotiri, buried around 1600 BCE during what's known as the Minoan eruption. Excavations started in the 60s and turned up multi-story buildings, pottery still sitting on shelves, storage jars lined up against walls, and detailed frescoes, all preserved by ash. Almost no human remains were found anywhere in the city, which means people must have got some kind of warning and got out of there before the worst of it. The site is pretty incredible. Room layouts are clearly visible, and a lot of the artifacts were pretty well preserved. It's like everyone just walked out one day and never came back, which, more or less, is exactly what happened. The eruption was huge though, probably affecting civilizations across the region. Most people know about Pompeii. Fewer people know that a town called Herculaneum got hit by the same eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, and in some ways, what happened there is even more disturbing. Herculaneum was a wealthy Roman resort town right on the coast. When Vesuvius erupted, the town got buried under a different kind of volcanic material than Pompeii. It wasn't ash, but waves of superheated gas and rock moving at enormous speed. For a long time, researchers assumed most people escaped because hardly any bodies were found. In the 80s, archaeologists started excavating the old shoreline, the area between the town and where the sea used to be. What they found were hundreds of skeletons crammed into arched storage vaults along the beach. People had run to the waterfront trying to escape by sea and then just got trapped there when the surge hit. Researchers think the temperature reached somewhere between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius. Death would have been essentially instantaneous, thankfully. But because Herculaneum was buried so deep and so fast, the skeletons were in unusually good condition. So good that researchers were able to recover DNA, identify diseases. They even found evidence of what people ate. One skeleton still had wooden furniture fused to the bones from the heat. Another had a bag of coins. A soldier was found with his sword, belt, and tools still attached. Another amazing find. Next, let's talk about mirror image life. This doesn't exist in nature today, but a group of top researchers is warning that if it's ever created, it could be dangerous in ways we don't fully understand. But what am I talking about? Well, all life on Earth, plants, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria. They all use molecules that are one-handed orientation, kind of like how your left hand is different from your right. Mirror image life would use the opposite versions of these molecules, meaning every basic component of life would be flipped like a reflection in a mirror. In December 2024, a group of 38 scientists, including 2 Nobel Prize winners, published a report warning about the risks of actually making these mirror organisms in the lab. They said that mirror microbes, for example mirror bacteria, could potentially, quote, escape immune defenses and invade natural ecosystems, leading to pervasive lethal infections in a substantial fraction of plant and animal species, including humans. That exact phrase comes straight from their risk assessment. They also said that because mirror bacteria would be so different from anything we've ever encountered, our immune systems might not recognize or fight them at all. Right now, no one's made a living mirror cell. Even many researchers who were exploring the idea have stopped, and dozens of biotechnology experts have signed a statement agreeing that mirror life shouldn't be created unless there's clear evidence it's safe. But yeah, whatever. I'm sure it's just not gonna stop anybody. The Doomsday Clock is a symbolic countdown created by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to show how close humanity is to disaster. Midnight means global catastrophe. Scientists adjust it each year based on things like nuclear weapons, climate change, and other big risks. In January 2025, the clock sat at 90 seconds to midnight. By January 2026, it moved even closer, 1 minute and 42 seconds. Closest it's ever been since its 78-year history. Here's why some people pay attention to this symbolic clock. It is based on real measurable risks that scientists track year after year. By moving the hands closer, the bulletin is saying that the state of the world, which involves everything from politics to technology and the environment, is more precarious now than at almost any time since the Cold War. That was heavy. Let's close out with something a little less, apocalyptic. There's a 2,200-year-old burial site in China that even top archaeologists are nervously avoiding cracking open, and that says a lot. It's the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who united all of China back in ancient times. You've almost certainly heard about the nearby life-size army of clay warriors, terracotta army discovered in the 70s, but the emperor's actual tomb chamber itself has never been opened by scientists. So, why the hesitation? There are a few real serious reasons. First, ancient historians wrote that the tomb might have been built with mechanical defenses and poison inside, like traps and rivers of liquid mercury, meant to protect it from intruders. Modern soil samples near the site show higher than expected mercury levels, which makes researchers worry that something hazardous could be inside. Second, even without traps, opening the chamber could just ruin whatever is inside. When the terracotta warriors were first unearthed, their once bright colors just flaked off as soon as they met the air, so they're being extra cautious. Right now, scientists are using tools like ground-penetrating scans and remote sensing to study what's down there without disturbing it. But till there's a way to safely explore the inside, the tomb is gonna have to stay sealed. In Tuscany, Italy, miners working in a coal mine back in the 50s started pulling out bones from the rock. First, it was just bits and pieces, then more kept showing up until they basically had parts of a whole skeleton coming out of the mine walls. What they found was Oreopithecus bamboli, an ape that lived around 9 million years ago. Right away, it threw scientists off. Some parts of it looked oddly human, especially the hips and legs, like it might have been able to stand or walk upright. But then other parts didn't match that at all, more like a regular ape that just lived in a weird environment. So it turned into this long-running debate. Some researchers think it was its own strange branch of evolution, possibly isolated on an ancient island. Others think it's just an ape that ended up with some unusual features because of where it lived, not anything close to human ancestry. Even the teeth didn't really help clear it up. Everything about it sits in this awkward middle ground. It just doesn't really neatly belong anywhere. In 1993, miners at a salt mine in Iran came across something pretty grim. A severed human head was sticking out of the salt, covered in crystals, with a beard, mustache, even a gold earring still attached. It was not alone. It ended up being the first of several mummified bodies that would later be called the Salt Men of Iran. Were all miners who died inside the tunnels, most likely in collapse collapses, and the salt ended up preserving them over thousands of years. The dry, salty environment basically stopped normal decay. Some of the bodies were found in unsettling positions too, their arms still raised, frozen at the exact moment they died. One of the creepiest is known as Salt Man number 4. He was a young man caught in a cave-in. His body turned out to be the most intact of all of them, with not just bones and skin preserved, but organs as well. They found tapeworm eggs inside him, so he must have eaten raw or undercooked meat just before he died. So far, at least 6 complete bodies have been found, possibly up to 8, with some dating back more than 10,000 years. During the Australian gold rush in the 1850s, thousands of miners flooded into a small settlement called Ballarat in the state of Victoria. It was one of the biggest gold hotspots in the country at the time, with entire camps popping up almost overnight. Inside one of the mining areas, near a place called the Bakery Hill, a group of 22 Cornish miners were digging about 180 feet underground when one of their picks hit something solid in the rock above them. First, it just felt like another stubborn section of rock, but as they chipped away at it, it became clear it wasn't a rock at all. It was gold. Not a thin vein either, but one massive chunk sitting embedded in the ceiling of the tunnel. When they finally freed it, the miners pulled out what would be called the welcome nugget. It was about 152 pounds, making it one of the largest gold nuggets ever discovered. When it broke free, there was chaos in the tunnel. Miners dropped everything they were doing to rush over and see it. Some were reportedly stunned by just how massive it was. After it was brought to the surface, it didn't stay intact for long though. It was sold, displayed for a time, and eventually melted down in London to be turned into coins. So the images you see of it now are replicas. In 2024, archaeologists digging through an ancient gold mine in Egypt found 2 sets of iron ankle shackles that were buried inside a storage building at a site called Goza, a mine that was active between 250 and 200 BCE. They've been described as some of the oldest shackles ever found in the Mediterranean. Design matched what ancient records already hinted at: prisoners of war and criminals being forced into mining work in Egypt during that period. But at Goza, researchers originally thought most of the miners were there willingly. There were no signs before this that would lead you to believe anyone was there against their will. For example, there were no guard posts, no locked living quarters. I mean, that's what you'd expect if the place was a forced labor camp. But iron restraints are definitely a sign that at least some of the workers in the mine had been forced to be there. On the southeast coast of India, there's a town called the Mahabalipuram, known for its ancient stone temples right by the sea. There have always been stories that there were more grand temples along that shoreline, but that most of them were swallowed by the ocean over time. For a long while, that sounded more like legend than proven history. But in 2004, a massive earthquake in the Indian Ocean set off a tsunami. And just before the waves hit the coast, the water briefly rushed away from the beach, exposing parts of the seafloor that nobody normally sees, and people reported seeing lines of stone and what looked like carved shapes out where the water usually is. After the disaster, once it was possible to go back safely, teams went out to look more closely. Under a few meters of water not far from shore, they found walls, carved blocks, and statues that matched the style of the surviving temple on land. Some stones clearly belonged to pillars or decorated parts of old buildings. The picture that's formed is that Mahabalipuram used to have a larger complex of temples and buildings along a coastline that's changed a lot over hundreds and hundreds of years. Off the southern coast of Jamaica, at the entrance to what's now Kingston Harbor, there used to be a town called Port Royal that was infamous in the 1600s. It was crowded with sailors, merchants, and most infamously, pirates. People called it one of the most sinful places in the Caribbean. The town sat on this narrow strip of sandy land, packed with wooden houses, brick buildings, and taverns. On June 7th, 1692, a powerful earthquake hit. Because the town was built on this loose, waterlogged sand, the ground kind of just gave away, and then whole streets split apart and large chunks of the town just slid straight into the harbor. And it happened so quickly that a lot of it ended up on the seafloor almost fully intact. Around 2,000 people died in minutes though. Today, parts of Old Port Royal are still underwater in relatively shallow, calm water, so you can go down there and see it. Divers have found some pretty incredible things down there too. Outlines of streets, rooms with objects still in place. A pocket watch stopped near the moment of the quake is one of the more famous finds. On the west coast of India, in a big bay called the Gulf of Kambat, researchers with the National Institute of Ocean Technology ran a survey to study the seafloor. In December of 2000, their equipment picked up patterns that didn't look purely random. Some lines and shapes seemed straight and grid-like, which led a few people to wonder they were seeing the remains of some ancient town. A few objects, like a piece of old wood and some fragments of material, were pulled up during the work. One date from that wood came back extremely old, 7500 BCE to be exact. So if those patterns really were the remains of buildings and streets, and the date was accurate, it would mean people were building large, organized communities in this area far earlier than most historians thought. But this stretch of sea is a tough place to study. Water is muddy, the currents are very intense, and the seafloor is constantly being stirred up. That makes it easy for natural ridges and ripples to look like straight lines on a scan, and for old objects to move far from where they originally came from. Some argue that there just isn't enough clear proof yet to say this was a city, that the patterns might just be natural. So this spot is better thought of as a mystery, but a cool one at that. North of Turkey and east of the Balkans, there's a big inland sea called the Black Sea. It has a strange feature. Once you go deep enough, the water doesn't have much oxygen in it. That might sound like a small detail, but it makes a huge difference for shipwrecks. The usual creatures that chew up wood can't live down there, so ships that sink to those depths can stay in much better shape than normal. In recent years, teams using robotic submarines found dozens of wrecks on the Black Sea floor. One of the most incredible is an ancient Greek trading ship, around 2,400 years old, sitting upright about 2 kilometers down. The mast is still standing, the shape of the hull is clear, and parts of the deck layout are still visible. Before this, historians mostly had to rely on pictures, painted on pottery, and a few broken remains to figure out how these ships were built. We've also found later ships from Roman times and the Middle Ages, many of them with cargo and details still in place, coiled ropes, carved decorations, and piles of jars and containers preserved in the mud. Instead of being torn apart by waves and sea life, these ships have ended up becoming more like underwater museums. On Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, there are thousands of water-filled sinkholes and caves known as cenotes. To the ancient Maya people who lived there, these weren't just natural pools, they were seen as entrances to the underworld and places where important rituals happened. Some of them connected into long underwater cave systems. In one of those systems, divers found the skeleton of a girl who lived about 13,000 years ago. Bones were discovered alongside the bones of ancient animals, some that are now extinct. Back when she died, these caves weren't underwater yet. People and animals could walk into them on dry ground. Later, rising water filled the caves and helped protect what was inside. And then much later, the Maya started using these same places for their ceremonies. Deep in the dark sections of some cenotes and caves, researchers have found pottery, incense burners, stone platforms, and human remains, and many of these seem to be offerings connected to rain and water gods. Between what's now Britain and mainland Europe, there used to be a huge stretch of dry land called Doggerland. Today it's under the North Sea, but back then it was a place with rivers, wetlands, and hunting grounds, not just a muddy strip of coast. As the Ice Age ended, sea levels slowly rose and swallowed more and more of it until only the highest areas were left. One major event in that story was a massive underwater landslide off Norway that sent this huge wave crashing into the area. That wave probably wiped out some of the last low-lying parts people could actually live on. Now it's all under dozens of meters of water, and the only reason we know it was once a busy landscape is because modern fishing boats keep dragging up bits of it. They've pulled up mammoth bones, antler tools, and even human remains from the seafloor. There are also traces of what people there were actually doing with materials. So for example, they used a kind of sticky black glue made from tree bark, which they would have heated in a very specific way to get it just right. It wasn't something that just happened by accident. In the waters south of China, there are 2 shipwrecks sitting so deep that no human diver will will ever reach them. We've only gotten a look at the ships through remotely operated submersibles. They date back to China's Ming Dynasty, about 500 years ago, and they're resting around a mile down on the ocean floor. What makes them so interesting is that they seem to show both directions of a trade route at the same time. The first ship was loaded with blue and white bowls and jars made of porcelain. They're stacked in these neat layers, and because it's so cold and dark down there, they're in surprisingly good condition. The second ship, about a dozen miles away, looks like it was on the opposite journey. It was carrying huge wooden logs, the kind of strong, dense woods that would be used for building ships or large buildings back in China. So you got one ship carrying Chinese products outward and another bringing raw materials in. Pretty interesting up close look at how their trade network operated. On the northwest coast of France, out in the Atlantic, there's a small island called Ile de Saint. Just off that island on the seafloor, divers found something that doesn't look like ordinary rock. It's a long line of big granite stones stretching about the length of a football field, and some of the blocks are standing upright. Today that whole thing is underwater, but when it was built, the sea level was much lower. Back then, this would have been on or near dry land. People had to move and arrange these heavy stones by hand, and they clearly didn't fall into place naturally. It lines up with other ancient stone sites in that part of France, where you see rows of standing stones and big stone structures on land. The exact purpose of this underwater wall isn't totally clear. It might have marked a boundary, been part of some larger structure, or had some kind of ritual meaning. What we can say is that people thousands of years ago were willing to organize big groups, move all these stones, and reshape their coastline. Over time, with rising seas and the changing shoreline, the place was just swallowed by the ocean, leaving this strange man-made line of stones resting under the waves. In Central Asia, high up in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, there's a huge lake called Issyk-Kul. Even though it sits in this cold, snowy area, the lake actually doesn't freeze. And under it, especially near the shore, there are signs of old settlements that used to sit right on the edge. Over time, earthquakes changed the shape of the coastline. Some parts of those old towns ended up below the waterline. Divers and survey teams have found foundations of buildings and burial areas, and the artifacts they pulled from the lake seem to come from different cultures, steppe nomads, settled farmers, and stuff that would have probably come from traders passing through with goods. And that's because Issyk-Kul sat along routes that connected China, the Middle East, and Europe. So it makes sense that towns here were busy stopping points. In 1968, a US B-52 broke apart in the air over Greenland and went down near Thule Air Base. It was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs on a Cold War alert mission. When it crashed, it threw radioactive material and bomb parts across miles of ice and into the water below. Crews spent months out there picking through snow and pulling debris off the seafloor. The US and Danish governments said everything was accounted for, no missing parts, no serious contamination, but in the 80s, declassified documents told a completely different story. One of the bomb's plutonium cores was never found. It's still sitting somewhere at the bottom of North Star Bay. People in the area got the worst of it. Radiation turned up in animals. Inuit hunters got sick from eating contaminated meat they'd picked off the ice, and nobody told them what they'd been exposed to. Documents later showed the search was called off when it got too expensive. Back in the early 2000s, NASA scientists started noticing something weird. They'd sent climate research to the press office, and when it came back, it didn't look the same. Important data would be missing. The wording felt watered down, and the urgency just wasn't there anymore. Jim Hansen, one of the main people behind modern climate science, said his work was getting delayed or subtly rewritten even before journalists ever saw it. And then in 2007, an Inspector General report confirmed it wasn't just in their heads. NASA press staff had actually been told to tweak headlines, cut important details, and avoid saying anything too direct about humans causing warming. A lot of that pressure was coming from the Bush White House, which wanted things to sound more uncertain. Hansen even said he had to push just to talk publicly about basic stuff like temperature records or melting ice, and it wasn't just NASA. Researchers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency said they were dealing with the same thing. After the report came out, NASA changed its communication rules and Congress stepped in, but by then, years of toned-down information had already gone out, making climate change seem way less serious than what scientists were actually finding behind the scenes. Around 2012, over 1,000 Canadian scientists signed an open letter saying the government had made it nearly impossible to talk about their own work. If they wanted to do an interview, it had to get cleared first, and the government media gatekeepers would step in, rewrite their answers, or just shut the whole thing down if it got uncomfortable. Fisheries scientists couldn't talk about salmon populations dying off without their words getting cut apart. Parks Canada shut down libraries packed with climate data, and some research stations lost funding right in the middle of ongoing studies. Under the Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, roughly 2,000 science jobs were cut. After Harper lost, in 2015, a review found over 700 scientists have been kept quiet on topics from Arctic ice to fish populations. Libraries have been cleaned out, and some of that data was gone for good. The researchers who knew the most stayed quiet because speaking up could mean losing their jobs. So years of work on pollution, wildlife, and climate just never made it out. Tobacco companies knew that cigarettes caused cancer starting in the 50s, but they spent the next 4 decades making sure that that didn't get out. One of the biggest companies was Philip Morris. They're the people behind brands like Marlboro. Internal memos from Philip Morris showed executives reading studies linking smoking to lung disease as early as 1953. So they responded by trying to muddy the waters, setting up the Tobacco Industry Research Committee to produce studies that made the science look shaky, and paying scientists to argue publicly that nicotine wasn't addictive and the cancer connection was just coincidence. And they ran ads saying more doctors smoke Camels, which is insane to picture nowadays. When lawsuits opened things up in the 90s, over 40 million pages of hidden research came out. One 1963 memo had a company VP writing internally that the case against smoking was already airtight and that it was really just about doing their best to downplay everything. Sometime in the 70s, a papyrus book turned up in Egypt. A farmer had found it in an ancient tomb on the east bank of the Nile River. It was an ancient text called the Gospel of Judas, written in the 2nd century. Unlike the version most people know, this one says Judas was actually Jesus' closest follower and that handing him over was something that they planned together. The text was smuggled out and passed through the black market until it ended up in a safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York, owned by a dealer named Freda Nussberger. Scholars already knew that this text existed. It was written about as far back as 180 CE, but nobody had seen the actual pages. It sat in that box in New York for 25 years, slowly falling apart. Nussberger tried selling it for $3 million in the 80s and couldn't find a buyer. In 2000, the Messinas Foundation bought it and passed it to National Geographic, who used infrared imaging to piece together 26 damaged pages and went public with it in 2006. The early church had labeled the text heresy, which is why it never made the Bible.
In 2014, researchers monitoring seismic activity in Antarctica picked up something they weren't looking for: a repeating, low-frequency sound coming from deep beneath the ice. At first, it was assumed to be shifting glaciers or tectonic movement, but the pattern didn't match anything known. The signal repeated in consistent intervals, almost like a pulse, and appeared to originate from a fixed location beneath miles of ice. What made it even stranger is that the frequency behaved more like a mechanical or biological rhythm than a natural geological process. Follow-up studies suggested it could be ice movement interacting with subglacial lakes, but no model has successfully recreated the exact pattern. To this day, it remains logged as an unexplained acoustic anomaly, a structured signal deep under one of the most isolated places on Earth with no confirmed source. In 2019, archaeologists working near Kalambo Falls in Zambia uncovered something that forced them to pause immediately. 2 large logs deliberately notched and fitted together, forming a structural joint. That might not sound shocking until the dating came back to around 300,000 years old. That places the construction long before modern humans were believed capable of building anything even remotely complex. The shaping of the wood showed clear tool use, intentional cutting, and precise placement, suggesting planning and design. not random arrangement. At that time in history, humans were thought to be using simple tools at best, not engineering interlocking wooden structures. There are no other confirmed structures like this from that era, which means either early humans were far more capable than we thought, or this is evidence of behavior we don't yet understand. In the 1970s, scientists analyzing uranium from Oklo and Gabon discovered something that shouldn't exist. The uranium had already undergone nuclear fission. Further investigation revealed that the site had functioned as a natural nuclear reactor nearly 2 billion years ago. While the official explanation is that groundwater moderated the reactions, allowing fission to occur naturally, the precision of the system is what makes it unsettling. The reactions occurred in cycles, starting and stopping in a controlled way, and the waste products remained contained in a manner strikingly similar to modern nuclear storage methods. Even today, replicating those exact conditions is extremely difficult. It's considered natural, but it behaves in a way that feels engineered, which is why it continues to be one of the strangest geological discoveries ever made. In 1944, a 10-year-old boy in Illinois reportedly broke open a lump of coal and found a small, perfectly shaped metal object inside. The coal itself was estimated to be hundreds of millions of years old, meaning whatever was inside it would have had to exist before the coal formed. The object was described as a bell-shaped brass alloy piece with intricate engravings, not something that forms naturally. Similar reports have surfaced over the years, often dismissed individually, but what makes this case stand out is the documentation and the consistency of the description. Skeptics argue contamination or misidentification, but no clear explanation has ever accounted for how a manufactured-looking object could be sealed inside ancient coal. If even one of these cases is accurate, it suggests something existed long before it should have. In 2021, scientists studying the deep ocean floor in the Pacific discovered something that directly contradicts what we understand about life: oxygen being produced in complete darkness. Normally, oxygen production requires photosynthesis, which requires sunlight. But in this case, oxygen was forming in environments thousands of meters below the surface where no light reaches. The source appeared to be chemical reactions involving polymetallic nodules on the seabed, but the process didn't fully match any known reaction capable of producing oxygen in those quantities. Even more concerning, this dark oxygen could be supporting ecosystems that shouldn't exist according to current biological models. The discovery doesn't just challenge one idea, it challenges the entire assumption that sunlight is required for oxygen generation and opening the door to completely unknown biological or chemical systems. In the 1930s, archaeologists near Baghdad discovered a small clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, a setup that, when filled with an acidic liquid, can produce an electrical charge. The object dates back to around 250 BCE. That alone is strange, but what makes it even more unsettling is that there's no clear evidence the people of that time had any documented understanding of electricity. Tests have shown the device can generate a measurable amount of voltage, leading some to believe it may have been used for electroplating or other unknown purposes. Others argue it may have had a completely different function, but the design is so specific, so close to a basic battery, that it's difficult to dismiss. It suggests knowledge that doesn't align with the historical timeline we've accepted. In 2008, scientists drilling deep into the Earth's crust in South Africa discovered something shocking. Living microorganisms nearly 3 kilometers below the surface, isolated from sunlight, oxygen, and surface ecosystems. These organisms weren't just surviving, they were thriving, feeding on chemical energy from radioactive decay in the surrounding rock. Some estimates suggest these life forms have been isolated for millions of years. What makes this discovery so unsettling is that it proves life can exist in environments previously thought completely uninhabitable. It also raises the possibility that entire ecosystems could exist deep underground, completely separate from surface life. It doesn't just change how we view Earth, it changes how we think about life existing elsewhere in the universe. In the 1960s, a man renovating his home in Turkey knocked down a wall and discovered a hidden passage. That passage led to something massive, an underground city known as Derinkuyu. It extended multiple levels deep and could have housed up to 20,000 people, complete with ventilation shafts, storage rooms, and living spaces. While underground shelters are known throughout history, the scale and complexity of Derinkuyu is what makes it strange. It required advanced planning, engineering, and coordination, yet the exact origins and timeline of its construction remain unclear. There are theories, but no definitive answers about who built it or how such a massive project was completed with the tools available at the time. It's not just an underground structure, it's an entire hidden world that existed beneath people's feet. In 1936, a couple hiking near London, Texas, discovered a rock formation that, when broken, revealed part of a hammer embedded inside. The surrounding rock was estimated by some to be over 100 million years old. The hammer itself appeared to be made of iron with a wooden handle, partially mineralized over time. Critics argue the rock could have formed around the hammer more recently, rather than the hammer being as old as the rock itself. But metallurgical analysis showed the iron was unusually pure compared to modern standards, adding another layer of mystery. While many scientists dismiss it as a geological oddity, no single explanation has fully resolved how a man-made object ended up encased in material that appears far older than human history. In 1976, in Laetoli, Tanzania, a team led by Mary Leakey discovered a trail of fossilized footprints preserved in volcanic ash. These prints were dated to around 3.6 million years ago and are widely considered some of the earliest evidence of bipedal walking. But what makes them so unsettling is how modern they look. The footprints show a fully upright gait, a defined arch, and a walking pattern nearly identical to modern humans. According to the standard timeline, humans with this level of anatomical structure shouldn't have existed yet. The prints are typically attributed to Australopithecus, but their stride and foot shape don't perfectly match what we would expect. It's one of those discoveries where the official explanation exists, but it doesn't completely fit, and the more closely you examine them, the more they seem like footprints left by something that shouldn't have been there.
Deep in northern Colombia, there is a coal mine that looks more like a giant scar across the land. It stretches for miles, all dust and exposed rock, with huge machines tearing through layers that have been buried for tens of millions of years. Well, around the early 2000s, a team started noticing unusual fossils coming out of the walls. Pieces of vertebrae and ribs, and they were massive. The bones were so large, they were initially mistaken for crocodile remains. The team kept collecting more and more fragments, slowly piecing the thing together. It took a long time before someone finally recognized the structure of the vertebrae for what it really was: a giant snake. And there were more than one, all from the same species, pulled from different parts of the mine. The snake was later named Titanoboa. Based on the bones, scientists estimated it could reach around 40 feet long, weighing over a ton. These fossils were sitting in rock layers that were about 58 million years old, from a time just after the dinosaurs disappeared. In 1709, miners in Sweden broke into a part of the fallen mine that had been sealed off and flooded for years. About 150 meters down, once the water drained, they saw something lying in the tunnel. It was a body, not bones, a full body with skin, still in his clothes. The body was so well preserved that everyone thought the man had died recently. But nobody was missing, and nobody recognized him. The mystery didn't last long once word spread, though. An older woman came to see the body and immediately knew who it was: her fiancé, Mats Israelsson, known as Fat Mats. He disappeared back in 1677, over 40 years earlier. Imagine going into a cave and seeing your dead fiancé that you hadn't seen in 40. That must have been a trip. And it was almost like he'd just died the week before. The mine had preserved him so well. The water he was trapped in was full of copper compounds that stopped normal decay. And so when they brought him up to the surface, his body slowly dried out and hardened. Papers at the time described him turning hard as wood. Instead of burying him, they put him on display, though, for decades. People traveled just to see him. He stayed like that for about 30 years before he was finally buried. Then he was dug up again years later, moved, stored, and displayed all over again before finally being laid to rest for good in 1930. Sounds like a very exhausting afterlife. Out in southern Thailand, there's a coal mine in Krabi where the ground has basically been peeled open layer by layer. That exposed rock ended up holding something way older than anyone expected. In 2013, researchers came across a tiny jaw and a few teeth, just fragments. But those fragments turned out to belong to a completely unknown primate species, later named Crabia minuta. It lived around 35 million years ago and only weighed about half a pound. It's a very interesting find because it comes from a time when early primates were somehow moving from Asia to Africa, even though this massive sea separated the continents. No one fully agrees on how that happened, and finds like this are rare for a simple reason. Thick jungle usually hides everything. It's almost impossible to find fossils in places like that because the ground is completely covered. In Missouri, there's a small town sitting on top of something most people would never expect. Underneath it is an old lead mine that used to stretch deep underground, with huge rooms carved out of solid rock over decades of digging. It started back in the 1800s and ran for nearly a century before shutting down in the early 60s. When the mining stopped, pumps that kept water out were turned off, and slowly groundwater started seeping in. It steadily rose, filled the tunnels level by level until most of the mine disappeared water. And what that left behind is pretty breathtaking now. The lower levels turned into this massive underground lake stretching for miles, holding around 1 billion gallons of water, and nothing was cleared out before it filled, so mining carts, tools, entire sections of equipment, even elevator shafts are still down there, exactly where they were left. And the place is open for tourists. Next up, we have dinosaur tracks on the ceiling. In Mount Morgan, Australia in 1952, miners working inside an old cave system came across something incredibly odd. High above them, stuck in the rock ceiling, were clear dinosaur footprints. Not one or two, either a whole trail of them, spaced out like an animal had been walking across wet ground, only instead of sitting under their feet like normal footprints, they were overhead, roughly 10 to 15 feet above where people stood inside the mine. For a long time, people, understandably, couldn't really agree on what they were seeing. Whatever creature made the tracks seemed to have moved in an unusual way, because the prints didn't always look clean and simple, but that didn't solve the bigger question. How was this dinosaur crawling on the roof like Spider-Man? What a terrifying image. Well, there is an answer. It comes down to how the ground changed over millions of years. Back then, it was a muddy lakeshore. Dinosaurs walked across it, leaving footprints behind, those prints filled with sediment and slowly hardened into rock. Over time, more layers built up above it, and then erosion and shifting started stripping away softer material underneath, especially once the cave system formed and mining exposed parts of it. What's left now is basically a flipped snapshot of that ancient surface. The original ground layer is now the roof, so you now see the footprints from below. New research shows people are coming into the world carrying dozens of man-made chemicals straight from the womb. Scientists ran some of the most detailed scans ever on umbilical cord samples from people born between 2003 and 2006. They found 42 different forever chemicals. Many of these are barely studied, and scientists still don't know exactly what all of them do. These forever chemicals are in everything from non-stick pans to stain-resistant clothes and firefighting foam. They earn the nickname because they never really leave your body. Early exposure like this can affect growth, immune response, and metabolism later in life, and this is happening before a person even takes their first breath, meaning these chemicals are baked in from day one. And since they're still widely used today, new generations are getting the same exposure. What kind of effect is this going to have on us decades from now? We can't say for sure, but scientists are racing to figure that out. Scientists around the world are seriously worried about a new climate record that just dropped for 2025. A massive international research team led by Li Jing at the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, found that the ocean absorbed more heat last year than ever before since modern measurements began. This analysis included data from more than 50 scientists across 31 research institutions in Asia, Europe, and North America. The oceans act like Earth's giant heat sponge. They soak up extra warmth trapped by greenhouse gases. In 2025, it rose higher than it ever has in recorded history. Part of the reason this matters so much is that oceans store heat for a long time, heat that doesn't just disappear during a cold winter. The effects are already showing up around the planet. Warmer ocean water changes changes storm patterns, fuels more intense rainfall and hurricanes, and plays a role in rising sea levels as the water expands. Scientists studying space rocks near Earth just dropped a sobering reality check. There are thousands of potentially dangerous asteroids out there that we haven't even found yet, and we don't have a ready way to stop them if one suddenly heads toward our planet. At a major scientific conference in Arizona, Dr. Kelly Fast, who leads NASA's planetary defense efforts, made it clear the situation isn't just theoretical, saying that what keeps her up at night are the asteroids they still don't know about. What does she mean by that, though, exactly? Well, scientists estimate there are about 25,000 near-Earth asteroids at sizes large enough to wipe out an entire city if they hit land. But so far, astronomers have only tracked about 40% of them. That means roughly 15,000 rocks big enough to cause serious destruction could be flying through space without us knowing where they are. These aren't the giant planet killers you see in movies. Thankfully, those massive asteroids are rare and mostly tracked already. This warning is about mid-sized rocks. You know, the ones that are only about the size of a football stadium. And yeah, it sounds big, but they're actually small enough to slip past current detection systems. There is some progress. NASA and partners plan to launch a new space telescope, the Near-Earth Object Surveyor, which will use heat-detecting sensors to spot dark, hard-to-see asteroids. The goal is to find upward of 90% of these dangerous objects within about a decade. But right now, Dr. Fast and other planetary defense experts admit that, although we can theoretically, change an asteroid's path, there's no fully ready system on standby today to deflect one that just comes out of nowhere. Scientists drilling deep into an ice cave in Romania recently found something that didn't just survive frozen for thousands of years, it resisted modern medicine. In ice that's been undisturbed for around 5,000 years, researchers pulled out a strain of bacteria called Psychrobacter SC65A3. When they tested it in a lab, they found it was resistant to 10 antibiotics that we still use today. Lead researcher Dr. Christina Percaria said, quote, "The Psychrobacter SC65A3 bacterial strain shows resistance to multiple modern antibiotics and carries over 100 resistance-related genes. The 10 antibiotics we found resistance to are widely used in oral and injectable therapies used to treat a range of serious bacterial infections in clinical practice. If melting ice releases these microbes, these genes could spread to modern bacteria, adding to the global challenge antibiotic resistance." End quote. And speaking of ice melting, scientists are warning that parts of the planet are inching toward tipping points that could change the climate in ways that are really hard, if not possible, to reverse. They're looking at massive ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, Arctic sea ice, and huge ocean currents. All systems that if pushed too far can trigger chain reactions and make the world hotter and less stable. Researchers like William Ripple from Oregon State University and Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute say some of these systems are closer to flipping than we realize. For example, melting ice exposes darker land or ocean underneath, which then absorbs more heat and melts even more ice. It's a loop that just feeds itself and accelerates the warming. If these feedbacks keep building, Earth could settle into this hotter, more extreme state, one that humans haven't experienced in 11,000 years. For 10 years, researchers left whale bones on the seafloor, expecting creatures called osedacs, also known as zombie worms, to show up. Zombie worms eat bones, but when they checked, not a single worm had colonized the skeletons. Zombie worms are strange, even by ocean standards. They have no mouth, no gut, and no anus. They grow root-like tubes to digest nutrients from bones with the help of bacteria. They're really important for recycling nutrients in the deep sea. Fabio De Leo from Ocean Networks Canada believes the worm's disappearance is linked to low oxygen levels, which are becoming more common in deep waters. Craig Smith from the University of Hawaii added, "It looks like the OMZ expansion, which is a consequence of ocean warming, will be bad news for these amazing whale fall and woodfall ecosystems." End quote. Now, OMZ stands for Oxygen Minimum Zones, and they're growing, making it harder for specialized deep-sea species like zombie worms to survive. Since early 2023, the world has been in the middle of the biggest coral bleaching event on record. Scientists say about 84% of the planet's reefs have been affected, which is higher than any previous global event. Coral bleaching Bleaching happens when water just gets too warm. Tiny algae living in the coral get stressed and they leave, taking the coral's color with them. Without algae, the coral turns white and becomes a lot weaker, more prone to disease and death. Marine scientist Melanie McField said some areas that used to have nearly half their living coral now have barely any. She called it unprecedented. Decades of watching reefs. This is happening across the globe, from the Pacific to the Caribbean, the Red Sea, and Florida. Reefs support a quarter of all marine species and billions of people worldwide, so losing them at this scale, that's a bit of a problem. Opal miners in Australia are usually after the colorful gemstones used in jewelry, and most days that's all they get. But in places like Lightning Ridge, a small outback town in New South Wales, sometimes they dig up something far more interesting. In 2015, for example, a miner found dinosaur remains where the bones hadn't just fossilized, they'd actually turned into solid opal. Over millions of years, silica-rich water slowly seeped into the spaces where the bones were, and instead of turning them into regular rock, like with normal fossils, it turned them into gemstone. It's beautiful. The result is this skeleton that glows with flashes of blue, green, and red, depending on how light hits it, of course. One specific find included 4 dinosaurs, from small juveniles up to a large adult, and every single one was preserved like this. It only happens under very specific conditions. The ground has to be acidic enough to dissolve the original bone, but stable enough to let the opal form and harden in its place without everything falling apart. Inside the abandoned copper mines of Paris Mountain in Wales, explorers found something that looks pretty nasty. Hanging from the low ceilings of the tunnels, long, pale, dripping filaments miners have nicknamed snotites, which gives you a pretty clear picture of what you're looking at. But these are actually living colonies of bacteria that survive in conditions that would kill almost anything else. The water running down the walls in these mines is about as acidic as battery acid. Most things would dissolve on contact, but these bacteria feed on the sulfur and minerals in the surrounding rock. And as they break down, they drip sulfuric acid onto the floor beneath them. One drop on bare skin is enough to leave a chemical burn. Scientists love them though, because they show just how far life can push into extreme conditions, and they give researchers a better idea of how something might actually survive in the acidic atmosphere of a planet like Venus. Up in Siberia, there's a whole industry built around blasting through walls of frozen ground looking for woolly mammoth ivory. Workers use high-pressure water hoses to melt through the permafrost and get at whatever's buried underneath. Because the ground has been frozen for over 10,000 years, the ivory isn't fossilized or turned to stone, it's still in its original state, sometimes looking so fresh it's hard to believe the animal died thousands of years ago. Along with tusks, miners have pulled out preserved hair, frozen skin, and whole mummified mammoths with grass still sitting in their stomachs from their last meal. Mammoth ivory is legal to sell, unlike elephant ivory, which makes it worth some serious money, but it's a risky job. The tunnels are carved into soft, melting mud that can collapse at any moment without any warning. Back in 1734, miners working deep inside a mountain in Hallstatt, Austria, were digging through a wall of rock, and they made a discovery that brought the entire operation to a halt. Embedded in this thick layer of salt and rubble, they found the body of a man, but this was not a skeleton. It was a fully preserved mummy. His skin, hair, even his clothing and shoes were intact, despite being buried under hundreds of feet of earth. The salt had basically pickled the guy. The miners at the time didn't have modern tools to date the body, obviously, so they just assumed he had to be a fellow worker who died in a recent collapse. It wasn't until much later that researchers realized just how old the man in the salt really was. He wasn't from the 1700s. He was a prehistoric miner from the Iron Age. Probably died in a massive cave-in around 350 BCE. He'd been trapped in that spot for over 2,000 years. In 1885, a worker named Riedel was at a coal mine in Wolfsegg, Austria, when he cracked open a large block of coal and found something that looked unnatural, like manufactured. It was this heavy iron object, but as you can see, it looked pretty strange. What really made it strange was a deep, sharp incision that ran all the way around the middle. People immediately started calling it the Wolfsegg iron, or the Salzburg cube, and rumors began to spread that this was an out-of-place artifact, possibly something from some ancient alien civilization. For decades, it was treated as a major scientific mystery. Some thought it might be a meteorite, but it lacked the nickel and typical crust you'd see on a space rock. It wasn't until the 60s that scientists finally got a closer look. They realized the iron wasn't millions of years old, instead it was cast iron. The most likely explanation is that the object was a piece of mining equipment, specifically a counterweight used in the machinery at the time, that had accidentally fallen into a crack in the ground, and then over time, as the coal settled and hardened around it, it became fused inside. Sadly, it wasn't actually some long-lost ancient artifact. More than 5,500 meters up on a volcano called Sarasara in southern Peru, archaeologists found the frozen body of a teenage Inca girl. They call her Sarita. She was discovered during surveys in the 90s, and she definitely didn't end up there by accident. She was part of something called a Capacocha ritual. The Inca would take young people to the tops of mountains as offerings to the gods. Around Sarita's body, researchers also found artifacts like miniature gold and silver figurines and pottery, all carefully arranged around her. The cold, dry air near the summit kept her relatively well preserved, by ancient dead body standards, that is. Researchers think the sacrificed would have died from exposure, like just left to die in the cold, or blunt force trauma. Definitely what I'd prefer. For the Inca, mountains weren't just mountains though. They called them apus, living beings that had power over things like weather and harvests. On February 20th, 1979, the Dieng Plateau in Indonesia looked completely calm. Then, gas started leaking from the craters. Gas was carbon dioxide, visible, odorless, and heavier than air. And then it started creeping into villages. By the time it cleared, 149 people were dead. People were found collapsed in the street, others were found inside their homes. It was horrific. Dieng is a whole complex of overlapping craters and vents, and the ground there constantly leaks volcanic gases. Usually it's minor, but pressure shifts underground can push out massive amounts all at once. Carbon dioxide pushes out the oxygen, and people can lose consciousness within minutes without even realizing anything is wrong. Monitoring improved after 1979, but the area has had gas scares since, with evacuations in both 2011 and 2017. So volcanoes don't always need to erupt to be deadly. We always think of them as such loud, obvious things, hot lava, but they can also be silent killers. In April 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted. It was the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. Wiped out villages across the island of Sumbawa. For almost 200 years, there were stories about this lost culture buried somewhere under all the ash and debris. Well, in 2004, archaeologists from the University of Rhode Island, led by Haraldur Sigurdsson, started digging on the slopes of Tambora and actually found it. Buried under all the volcanic debris were the remains of a whole settlement. They found carbonized wooden houses, bronze bowls, ceramic pots, iron tools, and the skeletal remains of at least 2 people. Sigurdsson called it a kind of Pompeii of the East, because the ash locked everything exactly where it had been all those years ago. Tambora's eruption also messed with global climate so badly that 1816 became known as the year without a summer, with crop failures across Europe and North America. On February 1st, 1814, Mayon volcano in the Philippines erupted. Lava flows and ash buried an entire town called Cagsawa. People ran into the stone church for shelter as everything came down around them. Hundreds died. Some put the death toll at over 1,000. When it was over, most of the town was just gone. The only thing still visible above ground today is the church bell tower. The rest of the building is buried under all this hardened volcanic debris, but homes, roads, and farmland are still down there under the ash. But that bell tower has become one of the most recognizable images in the Philippines, standing in this open field with Mayon's cone right behind it. It's kind of surreal and eerie to look at. It's this perfectly normal tower that just happens to be sitting in the middle of a field, nothing around it. On the slopes of an extinct volcano called Rocca Monfina in southern Italy, researchers found fossilized footprints pressed into hardened volcanic ash. The site is called Chiampate del Diavolo, or Devil's Footprints. Locals assumed for years that they were supernatural because the tracks go straight down an incredibly steep slope, and nobody could figure out how a person could walk that without slipping. In the early 2000s, scientists dated the ash layer to about 350,000 years ago. And the prints are extra cool because they most likely belonged to Homo heidelbergensis. This was an ancient human species that lived roughly between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago. ago. Think of them as a kind of middle chapter in human history. It came after Homo erectus, but before Neanderthals and us modern humans. They would have looked pretty rugged, with big brow ridges and wide faces and thick, strong bodies. Their brains were almost as large as ours. They made wooden spears, they hunted large animals, they probably worked together in organized groups as well. A lot of scientists think they're the common ancestors of both Neanderthals in Europe and our own species in Africa. So, after an eruption sent out fresh ash, a group of these early humans walked downhill across it before it hardened. Trackways show multiple of them, what appears to be adults and possibly a younger one. They found heel marks, toe impressions, a spot where one of them looked like they slipped on the way down. 350,000-year-old footprints still sitting there. Pretty amazing. Lake Kivu sits on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, near active volcanoes. The threat here isn't lava, it's what's dissolved in the water. The deep layers of the lake hold enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and methane trapped under pressure far below the surface. Scientists started paying close attention after the 1986 Lake Nyos disaster in Cameroon, where a sudden CO2 release killed over 1,700 people in a matter of hours. Research published in journals like Geophysical Research Letters showed that Lake Kivu is far more gas than Nyos ever did. If the deep water got disturbed, say by volcanic activity, an earthquake, or a large landslide, that gas could rise rapidly in what's called a limnic eruption. CO2 would pour out across the surrounding lowlands. About 2 million people live along the shoreline. I mean, it would be a total catastrophe. So, Rwanda has actually started pulling the methane out of the lake and using it for energy production, which doubles as a way to reduce how much gas is sitting down there. Starting in the early 1900s, archaeologists digging at a site called Vinca in Belgrade, Serbia, kept pulling up clay tablets covered in these strange markings. Those markings dated back to 5300 to 4500 BCE, more than 1,000 years before Sumerian cuneiform, which is supposed to be the oldest writing system ever discovered. But there were over 200 artifacts with repeating symbols. It looked like some kind of organized writing. Marija Gambudas, who is a Lithuanian archaeologist and anthropologist, called it the Old European script, and believed it was evidence of an advanced farming culture with real symbolic language. But there were some skeptics. The symbols don't show up in sequences long enough to decode, so most scholars figure they were ownership marks or clan symbols. But after that, the research kind of stalled out. Funding didn't really come through, so history books just stuck with the idea that writing started in Mesopotamia. Back in the 14 and 1500s, Spain and Portugal were racing to explore the oceans, and they treated maps and sailing routes like top-secret weapons. Christopher Columbus's journals from 1492 were locked up immediately by Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain at the time. The public got a vague idea of where he went, but the exact coordinates for gold and trade ports were kept secret. Portugal set up the Casa de India, basically a super tight government office, to control everything about the route to India. They burned any competing maps and even threw sailors in jail if they talked too much. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas split the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, but the exact boundary lines stayed secret so that rivals couldn't take advantage. Spain also had a master globe called the Padrón Real, which was updated only by navigators officially approved by the crown. Nobody else was allowed near it, and copying it without permission, that could be punishable by death. A cartographer named Diego Ribeiro actually got executed in 1533 for sharing too much information. And another case that shows just how precious this information was, well, in 1587, the English privateer Francis Drake attacked the Spanish port city of Cadiz. The most valuable things he grabbed weren't gold, weapons, it was navigation books. By 1600, over 90% of Columbus's journals were still locked in royal vaults. In 1889, a University of Pennsylvania team dug up 30,000 clay tablets at Nippur in Iraq, one of the most important cities in ancient Sumer. The tablets had math tables, hymns, and stories 1,000 years older than the Bible. Ottomans seized a big chunk of the collection during the dig. The University of Penn ended up with 20,000. Istanbul kept the rest. The tablets basically sat in basements in Philadelphia for decades. Then World War I happened, funding ran out, and a bunch of the researchers died before they could finish going through everything. By 1920, only 2,000 had been looked at, and then a fire in 1948 destroyed more. Over in Istanbul, the other half got shoved into storage with no labels and basically sat untouched until the 2010s. When Penn's collection finally got properly opened in the 80s, researchers found lost king lists, flood stories that mirror Noah, the oldest school records ever found, and job contracts from 2500 BCE. Iraq's half stayed locked through decades of war, and when Baghdad's museum got looted in 2003, thousands more were lost or destroyed. Boeing's X-37B looks like a miniature space shuttle. It flies without a crew, and no one outside the military really knows what it's doing up there. First launched in 2010, and its missions just kept getting longer. The first one lasted 224 days, and by 2026, the seventh had been orbiting for 908 days. Its flight path is secret, but hobbyist astronomers using public data have spotted it zipping over the Pacific and near Russia. Officially, it's testing reusable space technology, but almost everything it carries is a secret. It can change orbits fast, and during one mission it logged avoiding debris publicly while making other orbital changes that it never mentioned. When it pulled up close to a Russian satellite in 2024, it set off this real debate about whether it could be used as a weapon. China launched their own version called Shenlong in 2023. The program costs around $1.8 billion a year though, more than what the US spends on the International Space Station, so it's doing something important up there. While SpaceX streams almost everything they do, the X-37B goes completely dark. It just lands, rolls to a stop, and that's it. Whatever it's up to, the public still has zero answers. Everything is classified.